Hello everyone, welcome to Sleepy Crimes Hub. I'm here with you tonight to help you relax and slowly fall asleep. I know many of you are watching this video to rest your mind. So before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Now get comfortable, close your eyes if you like, take a deep breath, and let go of the day. Let's gently begin with case 1. Luis Garavito grew up in a troubled household where neglect and abuse were constant, describing his father as a womanizer and recalling frequent, intense arguments between his parents that created an atmosphere of conflict and fear. He later reflected that he had the misfortune of being in a family that spent its time arguing, fighting, and throwing words of great caliber, and stated that his father often physically abused the family, prompting him and his siblings to hide to avoid confrontation. Garavito recalled that his father's interactions with him were limited to work-related tasks and errands, during which he was frequently berated. At Simone Bolivar School in Sealand, he faced persistent teasing and ridicule from other children, struggled academically in most subjects, and earned the nickname Garabato, meaning squiggle, because of his glasses. The bullying he endured led him to spend recess alone, further isolating him from his peers and reinforcing his preference for solitude. Around 1968, Garavito's father pulled him out of 5th grade so that he could contribute financially to the family, a decision that effectively discouraged him from forming friendships or interacting with girls, as his focus was redirected entirely toward earning money for their struggling household. The following year, in 1969, during a routine vaccination visit arranged by his father, Garavito alleged that he was sexually molested by the attending pharmacist phlebotomist, a devoutly religious man who also happened to be the family's neighbor and reportedly close to his father. Garavito claimed that the man inflicted further abuse, including biting, burning, and cutting him during the incident, though experts and others have questioned the accuracy of these allegations. Following this initial incident of abuse, Garavito reportedly reacted by killing and dissecting 2 birds out of frustration, and then allegedly began to sexually fondle and inappropriately watch his younger siblings, marking the beginning of increasingly disturbing behaviors. Garavito also claimed to have molested a 6-year-old boy in 1969, and according to family and friends, he became increasingly withdrawn, extremely aggressive, and was described as being ready to take revenge on the world. In 1971, Garavito's family relocated to Trujillo, though he did not disclose his earlier experiences of abuse, fearing that his family would not believe him. Shortly after arriving, a neighbor exposed him to heterosexual pornography, mocked his discomfort, and reportedly both beat and sexually assaulted him. Around this time, Garavito also began consuming alcohol, introduced to it through his family. In 1972 and 1973, Garavito engaged in a series of increasingly concerning and criminal behaviors that led to repeated conflicts with his family and brief detentions by authorities. These incidents resulted in multiple evictions by his mother and reprimand from his father, reflecting a pattern of escalating antisocial conduct. This period marked a significant intensification of his problematic behavior, which contributed to his growing notoriety and ongoing legal troubles as a young adult. Garavito held various jobs, beginning as an assistant at a compensation fund and later working in a chain of stores while studying marketing. His behavior at these positions, however, led to conflicts and physical altercations with clients, coworkers, and supervisors, ultimately resulting in job loss. He then worked as a street vendor selling religious icons and as a migrant laborer, during which he formed platonic relationships with older women. Earlier in his youth, while working on a coffee plantation in Trujillo, he developed an attachment to a schoolteacher and single mother, Luz Mary Ocampo Orozco, attending weekly mass services with her. Garavito maintained relationships with women who had children, and he reportedly treated their children with care while being a supportive partner when sober. Those close to him described him as generally amicable, though he was known to have a violent temper and, on occasion, made threats when intoxicated. His alcohol use often exacerbated controlling, jealous, and aggressive behaviors, which led to frequent conflicts and tensions in his personal life. Consequently, he became the focus of local gossip and scandals, and his relationships with female partners were often unstable, resulting in repeated evictions throughout his adult life. During the 1970s, Garavito experienced significant mental health struggles, including symptoms of psychosis, paranoia, and depression, alongside ongoing behavioral problems that increasingly concerned those around him. He expressed frustration and distress over his perceived lack of personal and professional achievement and his desire to start a family, while also struggling with intimate relationships due to difficulties that arose during periods of alcohol use. These challenges contributed to deep emotional distress, frequent anger, and tension within his family and personal life. In 1978, Garavito began attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and converted to the Pentecostal faith, working as a store clerk where he met his first long-term partner, Luz Mary. He became increasingly distant from his family, maintaining a limited relationship only with his older sister, Esther, who largely avoided him due to his struggles with alcoholism, while also experiencing tensions with his younger siblings over perceived parental favoritism. After relocating to the town of Armenia, he took a job at a local bakery and regularly attended church services, demonstrating fervent religious practices such as beating his chest during prayer. During this period, he continued attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and occasionally sought psychiatric support, while maintaining private behaviors that reflected ongoing antisocial tendencies. During the 1980s, Garavito's job at a bakery ended after repeated conflicts and physical fights with co-workers, an event that was followed by a suicide attempt. In the spring of 1980, he sought psychiatric treatment at San Juan de Dios Hospital and was hospitalized multiple times, expressing profound despair and stating that he believed his life was worth nothing and that he wished to die. Although he displayed signs of severe psychological disturbance, including psychosis and disordered eating, his primary diagnosis and treatment focused on depression, though he was also prescribed antipsychotic medication. During psychiatric evaluations, Garavito attempted to explain the reasons behind his suicidal thoughts, initially stating that he wanted children before rephrasing his words to indicate a desire to start a family, reflecting his emotional confusion and ongoing mental instability during this period. In 1980, Garavito began working at a supermarket in Armenia, Quindio, where he received extended lunch breaks on Thursdays and Sundays. During this period, he entered a brief relationship with a single mother named Claudia, which ended after he was unable to meet her expectations. Following the breakup, Garavito engaged in criminal and abusive behavior toward minors, acting on compulsions that reflected escalating psychological instability. By the autumn of 1980, he began carrying various implements, marking a continuation of his dangerous tendencies and antisocial conduct. Following his criminal acts, Garavito maintained a series of personal rituals, including recording the names of his victims in a notebook and performing intense, repetitive behaviors in private. He read the Bible nightly, especially the Book of Psalms, in an attempt to understand his own deviant impulses, and he also explored esoteric subjects such as astrology, tarot, and the occult after receiving related books from a friend. He frequently consulted fortune tellers, but ultimately found them unhelpful. During this period, he suffered from severe depression and guilt, experiencing nightmares and emotional distress connected to his past actions, reflecting the deep psychological turmoil underlying his behaviors. By the early 1980s, Garavito became obsessed with Adolf Hitler after reading Mein Kampf, drawing parallels between their lives, including traumatic childhoods, periods of vagrancy, and early experiences of isolation. He developed a fascination with the Holocaust and expressed admiration for historical mass violence. On January 25, 1984, his 27th birthday, Garavito experienced a mental breakdown and was hospitalized under psychiatric care for 33 days, receiving antipsychotic medication and psychotherapy for depression. After being granted temporary leave on February 28, he fled to Pereira, Department of Risaralda, where he committed further criminal and abusive acts against minors, leaving evidence of his activities with his older sister. He continued to collect and carry various implements associated with his crimes, By this time, he had committed a significant number of abusive acts, and he was briefly detained for unrelated theft, highlighting both the escalation and persistence of his criminal behavior. Garavito also became fixated on domestic terrorist Campo Elias Delgado, a self-declared Vietnam veteran who murdered his own mother and several others at a Bogotá restaurant in December 1986. He admired the attention Delgado received in the media and expressed a desire to emulate aspects of Delgado's notoriety while observing news coverage with others at a bar. From this period onward, Garavito fantasized about acquiring a weapon to harm his family and then end his own life, idolizing certain murderers and considering a mass attack followed by suicide as an idealized form of death for himself. During this period, Garavito entered a relationship with a single mother, Graciela Zabalita, who lived near the psychiatric centers where he had previously been committed. After meeting her, he suggested that she become his permanent companion, and she allowed him to live with her in Pereira in exchange for contributing to household meals and bills. While he was often absent, Garavito acted as a protective, fatherly presence in the home. However, Zabalita grew cautious of his alcoholism, which frequently appeared to trigger erratic, antisocial, and scandalous behavior, reflecting ongoing struggles with impulse control and personal stability. By the late 1980s, Garavito's acquaintances, including Jairo Toro and Ancesar Valencia, observed troubling behavior involving minors, which gradually raised awareness of his abusive tendencies. Despite this, he was not directly confronted, and his friends remained largely unaware of the full extent of his crimes. Beginning in 1988, Garavito started documenting his criminal activities and keeping items connected to his offenses, storing them in black cloth suitcases at various residences, reflecting a methodical escalation in his antisocial and criminal behavior. Between 1980 and 1992, Garavito engaged in repeated abusive and criminal acts against minors, a period during which he also spent 5 years under psychiatric care and made several suicide attempts. Reports of assaults on children increased in areas where he resided, reflecting a significant escalation in his dangerous behavior. During this time, he engaged in occult practices, including using a Ouija board, which he claimed triggered episodes of psychosis and delusional thinking. On October 1st, 1992, while under the influence of alcohol, Garavito attempted his first known violent assault on a young boy in the Melia Hotel sector of Bolivar, Colombia, but was interrupted by local authorities. During the incident, he was injured and briefly detained, highlighting both the escalation of his criminal activity and his deteriorating mental state. On October 4th, 1992, Garavito committed his first known murder, marking the start of a series of violent crimes. To avoid detection, he began wearing disguises and cultivated a public image as a generous figure locally known as Goofy, with neighbors often assisting him despite suspicions. Over the years, he documented his criminal activities using personal items connected to his victims, keeping them in a black cloth suitcase, which he later entrusted to family members. By June 1996, Garavito was struggling financially, having lost a temporary job as a salesman, and sought accommodation from his girlfriend Luz Mary, who reluctantly allowed him to stay. In August 1996, he suffered a serious fall in the Guacamayas neighborhood of Bogotá, breaking his leg, and relied on crutches, a neck brace, and a cast, while intermittently begging on the street for support during his 2-month stay with Luz Mary. These events reflected both his escalating criminal behavior and ongoing struggles with personal instability, health, and social dependence. During this period, Garavito contributed to the household by paying for meals and providing items such as a television. Yet his behavior remained volatile and hostile. He became involved in conflicts within the home, including an altercation with his girlfriend's teenage son, which, along with damaging a gift, led Luz Mary to a victim. Later that year, on Christmas Day, Garavito made an angry, drunken phone call in response to a visitor, and the following morning he appeared at the house shouting threats and grabbing at Luz Mary's throat, prompting her and the family to seek safety at a neighbor's home. After several hours, he left an apology note asking for forgiveness for the disruption he caused. Locals nicknamed him Conflict due to his frequent public intoxication, constant movement between towns, domestic disputes, abusive behavior toward partners, and general inability to maintain normal social interactions. This pattern of erratic behavior left him unable to form or sustain close relationships and further highlighted his instability. Toward the end of his criminal activities, Garavito drifted through western Colombia as a homeless wanderer, growing frustrated with his previous offenses and the ease with which he committed them. He reportedly developed plans for a large-scale attack targeting adults, intending to attract public attention and potentially die in the process. However, on April 22, 1999, Garavito was detained for the attempted assault of a minor before these plans could be carried out, marking the end of his active criminal spree and leading to his eventual apprehension by authorities. By the early 1990s, Garavito's apathy toward his previous criminal acts escalated to murder. On October 4, 1992, he encountered 13-year-old Juan Carlos near a bazaar in Jamundí, Colombia, where he had been drinking. Garavito later described feeling an intense psychological reaction, which he attributed to childhood memories and inner agitation. He followed the boy to a remote area near the railroad, where the child was later found deceased with severe injuries. Garavito claimed he experienced blackouts during the incident and felt deep remorse upon discovering blood on his clothing the next morning, reflecting both the gravity of his actions and his complex psychological state. On October 10, 1992, Garavito traveled to Trujillo to visit his sister Esther. While drinking brandy to manage his impulses, he became agitated and violent, resulting in the murder of a 12-year-old boy, Johan Alexander Penaranda, in Tuluá on his way to his sister's residence. Over the following months, he continued to target children across multiple locations, systematically escalating the severity and frequency of his attacks. In 1993, he lured several children aged 9 to 11 to isolated areas in the La Victoria district, committing further murders while taking steps to conceal evidence and avoid detection. During this period, he traveled extensively, including to southeast Bogotá, Maysan, Tuluá, Pereira, and Quimbaya, committing additional murders along the way. His spree concluded later in 1993 with the death of 13-year-old Mauricio Monedero Mejia, marking the end of this particularly violent phase of his criminal activity and demonstrating the progression and geographic range of his offenses. In early 1994, Garavito continued his pattern of targeting minors. On one occasion, he lured a Bogotá youth, estimated to be around 12 years old, who had fallen asleep on a bus. While attempting to control his impulses with alcohol, he led the child to a secluded area, where he became disoriented and discovered the presence of a mass grave, prompting him to release the child temporarily. Tragically, the situation escalated, and the child was ultimately killed, reflecting both Garavito's increasing control over his victims and his violent tendencies. On February 4, 1994, he lured 13-year-old Jamie Andres Gonzalez from the Plaza de Bolivar to a remote location, where he committed another murder. During this event, Garavito experienced a brief psychotic episode, reportedly influenced by a large crucifix, leading him to pray and recite scripture for hours afterward. Later, on January 12, 1997, he murdered an 8-year-old boy, along with 2 additional minors during this period, demonstrating the continued escalation and persistence of his criminal behavior. In early 1994, Garavito continued his pattern of targeting minors. On one occasion, he lured a Bogotá youth, estimated to be around 12 years old, who had fallen asleep on a bus. While attempting to control his impulses with alcohol, he led the child to a secluded area, where he became disoriented and discovered the presence of a mass grave, prompting him to release the child temporarily. Tragically, the situation escalated, and the child was ultimately killed, reflecting both Garavito's increasing control over his victims and his violent tendencies. On February 4, 1994, he lured 13-year-old Jamie Andres Gonzalez from the Plaza de Bolivar to a remote location, where he committed another murder. During this event, Garavito experienced a brief psychotic episode, reportedly influenced by a large crucifix, leading him to pray and recite scripture for hours afterward. Later, on January 12, 1997, he murdered an 8-year-old boy, along with 2 additional minors during this period, demonstrating the continued escalation and persistence of his criminal behavior. The Garavito's victims were almost exclusively boys, though local media and official records also note that he molested and murdered some female victims during his crime spree. In addition to the 172 initial murder charges, he later confessed in 2003 to 28 more killings, including 5 adults, stating that he had ordered the deaths of those adult victims. Garavito's violence was not confined to Colombia. During the summer of 1998, he was reported to have operated in Ecuador, where he murdered 14-year-old Abel Gustavo Loerveles and 12-year-old Jimmy Leonardo Palacios Anchundia in Chon, Ecuador, both of whom came from poor families and disappeared at noon. After these incidents, he was spotted near an all-girls school in Santo Domingo, Ecuador, before fleeing as authorities prepared an operation to capture him, and investigators later found 2 bodies at that site, including a young girl killed in a manner similar to Garavito's known methods. Locals recognized him as a foreign drifter begging for money because of his distinctive Colombian accent. In addition to the confirmed crimes in Colombia and Ecuador, Garavito also stated that he had committed at least 1 murder in Venezuela, further extending the geographic scope of his offenses. In 1979, Garavito targeted 9-year-old William Trujillo Mora in the Valle del Cauca region, while the boy was about to join other children at play. Armed with a machete, Garavito coerced Trujillo to comply with threats of violence and led him to an abandoned building. There, Trujillo was subjected to abuse and forced to endure a prolonged period of confinement. At one point, when Garavito became unconscious due to alcohol consumption, Trujillo seized the opportunity to escape. His experience was later recounted publicly, including an interview on the Colombian television program Los Informantes, providing insight into the tactics Garavito used to control and terrorize his victims. In 1988, Garavito lured an unidentified child near a restaurant called El Arepizzo in the Alto del Rio sector of Calarca, Quindio, a site where several bodies were later discovered within a short distance of one another. Years later, on January 25, 1999, which coincided with Garavito's 42nd birthday and followed a major earthquake, authorities located the owner of the now-destroyed restaurant. The owner recognized Garavito, noting that he had known him for many years, but had generally avoided him due to his aggressive behavior and alcohol use, ultimately providing investigators with information that helped direct them toward him. In the early 1990s, Garavito targeted 10-year-old Carlos Alberto in the Circasia sector of Quindio. He approached the child with gifts and money, leading him to a secluded area at Alto de la Taza. There, Garavito threatened and restrained the boy, inflicting abuse and trauma. Afterward, he made remarks intended to intimidate and manipulate Carlos before departing. The encounter exemplified Garavito's method of targeting vulnerable children and exerting control over his victims while instilling fear. In the 1990s, 16-year-old Brand Fernie Bernal Alvarez, who worked with his father in the cockfighting business, was targeted by Garavito. While Bernal tended to the roosters, Garavito coerced him with a knife and led him to a secluded location. There, Garavito restrained and inflicted severe physical abuse on Bernal, employing extreme violence in an attempt to control him. Bernal was ultimately able to break free from his restraints and escape, surviving the encounter. This incident highlights Garavito's escalating violence and the dangerous methods he used to dominate his victims. According to reports, Garavito primarily targeted children from vulnerable backgrounds, including those who were working class, homeless, orphaned, or living in rural areas. He would seek out these children and lure them away by offering small incentives such as money, candy, or odd jobs, motivated by impulses he described as an uncontrollable force within him. He preferred children who appeared physically innocent, often noting features such as fair skin or light-colored eyes, and used his knowledge of the Paisa region of Colombia to identify potential victims. Despite being afraid of the dark, Garavito approached his victims in broad daylight in public areas, from countryside paths to busy city streets. He also frequented areas near schools in the evenings while consuming alcohol, waiting for opportunities to isolate children. To gain trust and reduce suspicion, he often disguised himself as various authority figures or elderly men, and would change these appearances frequently to avoid recognition while carrying out his offenses. Once Garavito gained the trust of a child, he would lead them to a secluded location or isolated area, sometimes near mass grave sites, and engage them in conversation to make them feel comfortable and vulnerable. During these encounters, he would often consume alcohol, further impairing his judgment while intimidating the child and exerting control. Garavito also incorporated ritualistic behaviors and references to satanic practices, which he described as a pact with the devil, into his crimes, reflecting his disturbed psychological state. Victims were subjected to prolonged periods of physical abuse and torture, including beating, burning, and other methods intended to cause extreme suffering. Garavito inflicted severe injuries with various implements, leaving deep wounds on the body, while also using restraint and intimidation to maintain control. These acts were part of a repeated pattern of escalating violence and ritualized behavior, demonstrating both his sadistic tendencies and the premeditated nature of his crimes. That Garavito's crimes escalated to extreme acts of violence. He inflicted fatal injuries on his victims, often using knives and other implements, and in some cases, mutilated their bodies. Investigators found the victims' bodies completely exposed, with signs of severe physical abuse, restraint, and torture. Items such as containers and alcohol were found near the crime scenes, suggesting ritualistic or compulsive behaviors. Most of the corpses showed evidence of prolonged suffering, reflecting the premeditated and sadistic nature of Garavito's offenses. His actions demonstrated a deep psychological disturbance and obsession with control and domination over his victims. Beginning in the 1980s, children from impoverished and vulnerable backgrounds, referred to locally as desechables disposable, began disappearing at an alarming rate from the streets of Colombia. The ongoing civil conflict at the time made it unlikely that missing children would be reported. On November 7, 1998, a group of children playing football in Pereira discovered a skeleton, but authorities initially paid little attention. By November 15th, investigations uncovered mass graves containing the remains of as many as 36 children, almost all boys, showing evidence of binding, abuse, and prolonged physical trauma. In total, investigators found 41 children in the department of Risaralda and an additional 27 children in neighboring Valle del Cauca, highlighting the extensive scale of these violent acts. The large number of missing children prompted a widespread investigation, as the killings were not confined to a single area. The extreme brutality initially led authorities to hypothesize that the crimes might involve a satanic cult or an international criminal network. However, the prosecutor's office soon concluded that a single individual was likely responsible, based on the repeated presence of items such as nylon cord and liquor bottle caps at multiple crime scenes. That on February 6, 1999, near the town of Palmyra, authorities discovered the bodies of 2 children lying next to each other on a hill near a sugarcane field, followed the next day by another child's body just meters away. All 3 victims have been bound and subjected to severe physical abuse, with evidence of trauma to the neck, back, and limbs. The murder weapon was found nearby. Garavito had reportedly passed out partially unclothed atop one of the bodies while intoxicated, inadvertently starting a fire in the sugarcane field and sustaining serious burns. Items such as his money, glasses, clothing, and a note containing the address of Graciela Zabalita were recovered from the scene, linking him to the crime. From the glasses left at a crime scene, authorities determined that the perpetrator was middle-aged and had astigmatism in his left eye. His shoes indicated he walked with a limp and that he was approximately 163 to 167 centimeters, 5 feet 4 inches, 5 feet 6 inches tall. Based on these clues, investigators initially wrongly arrested a local sex offender, Pedro Pablo Ramirez Garcia. who was 44 and had a limp in his right foot. He remained in custody until additional children disappeared in Bogota. Meanwhile, Aldemar Duran, the lead detective on the case, began suspecting Garavito as the true offender. Garavito's girlfriend was contacted. She reported not having seen him since December, but handed over a black cloth suitcase he had left with her. The suitcase contained photographs, detailed journals, tally records of victims, and various personal items, which led investigators to Garavito's residence, though the property was vacant. Authorities believed he was either traveling for work or seeking his next victim. Following further investigation and interviews with Garavito's girlfriend and sister, Pedro Garcia was released, allowing the police to focus on tracking down Garavito. Garavito was apprehended by local authorities shortly after being linked to an unrelated attempted assault on 12-year-old John Ivan Sebogal. On April 22, 1999, while drinking in the city of Villavicencio, Garavito encountered Sebogal, who was selling lottery tickets. Using the alias Bonifacio Morera Lizcano, he lured the boy into a taxi and led him to a secluded hillside where he threatened and restrained the child, engaging in abusive and controlling behavior. During this incident, Garavito was observed displaying erratic, aggressive, and predatory conduct, which directly led to his capture by authorities. A 16-year-old homeless boy nearby witnessed the altercation between Garavito and the child and attempted to intervene by throwing stones and cursing. Garavito pursued the teenager with a dagger, causing both boys to flee to the Rosa Blanca farmhouse on La Coralina Road in Villavicencio, where they encountered a 12-year-old girl. Garavito later arrived at the farmhouse, aggressively asking the girl for directions. She guided him into the nearby woods, where he became lost. Authorities were contacted and a search was initiated. Around 7 p.m., Garavito was found walking out of the woods. He provided a false identification as the politician Lizcano, but investigators remained suspicious. Their suspicion was confirmed on 4 July 1999 that for Colombia's Justice Department, Garavito's confession alone was insufficient to secure conviction. Investigators noted that he had a rare eye condition found only in men of a specific age group, and his custom-made glasses were discovered at crime scene. Additional items, including bottles of brandy, his shoes, and underwear, were also recovered, and DNA evidence linked him to the victims. To confirm the glasses belonged to Garavito, authorities required all inmates in the detention facility to undergo eye exams, a strategy that prevented Garavito from concealing his condition. His height of 165 centimeters, 5 feet 5 inches, and noticeable limp further corroborated the investigative findings and helped connect him to the crimes. While Garavito was temporarily out of his cell, investigators collected DNA samples from his pillow and living area, which matched the DNA recovered from his victims. In October, Garavito was interrogated for more than 12 hours, during which a detective read his crimes aloud, prompting him to cry. He admitted that he would become intoxicated and seek out young boys, asserting that he was not homosexual but a victim of childhood sexual abuse, and confessed to assaulting and murdering approximately 140 children across various locations. He was ultimately found guilty on 138 of 172 counts, with the remaining cases still under investigation. Garavito was sentenced to 1,853 years and 9 days, the longest sentence in Colombian history. However, under Colombian law, imprisonment is capped at 40 years, and because he assisted authorities in locating victims' remains, his sentence was further reduced to 22 years. Garavito served his sentence in a maximum security prison in Valledupar, located in the department of El Cesar, Colombia. He was held in isolation from other inmates due to concerns for his safety, as authorities feared he could be attacked or killed. Under Colombian law, he could have been eligible for parole in 2023 after serving 3/5 of his sentence. However, in 2021, a judge denied an early release request for good behavior, citing that Garavito had not paid fines owed to his victims. Despite his imprisonment, Garavito reportedly remained hopeful, sharing with Colombian Senator Carlos Moreno de Caro plans to enter Congress become a Pentecostal pastor, and marry, with the intention of helping abused children if released. He suffered from severe eye cancer and leukemia, which left him blind, weak, and fatigued, requiring daily blood transfusions. While in the prison medical unit, he spent much of his time crafting handcuffs, earrings, and necklaces. Psychiatrists diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder and observed narcissistic personality traits. Jairo Garavito passed away at the age of 66 on October 12, 2023, in a hospital in Valledupar. His death was attributed to a combination of heart attack, tuberculosis, leukemia, and eye cancer. Many Colombians expressed outrage at the possibility of Garavito's early release. Over the years, public sentiment increasingly reflected the belief that his sentence was insufficient given the scale and brutality of his crimes. Some argued that Garavito deserved life imprisonment or the death penalty, though neither exists under Colombian law. At the time of his conviction, Colombian law did not allow for a sentence longer than what Garavito received, a limitation seen by many as a legal gap exposed by the emergence of a serial killer in the country. Since then, legislation has been amended to increase the maximum penalty for such crimes to 60 years in prison. In 2006, journalist Guillermo Prieto Piri La Rada interviewed Garavito for a televised program aired on June 11. During the interview, Garavito reportedly attempted to downplay his actions and expressed an interest in pursuing a political career aimed at helping abused children. Prieto also detailed Garavito's prison conditions and noted that, due to good behavior, Garavito might have been eligible to apply for early release within 3 years. Case 2, let me explain. Daniel Camargo Barbosa, born January 22, 1930, died November 13, 1994, was a notorious Colombian serial killer and sexual predator. Recognized as one of history's most prolific killers, he is believed to have sexually assaulted and murdered at least 72 young girls across Colombia and Ecuador during the 1970s and 1980s. Daniel Camargo Barbosa lost his mother before he turned one, leaving him with a distant and authoritarian father. His father later remarried Dioselina Fernandez, a woman who faced fertility issues and directed her frustrations toward Daniel. She subjected him to repeated abuse and humiliation, including dressing him as a girl and forcing him to attend school in that attire, which caused ridicule from his classmates. Despite these early traumas, Daniel excelled academically at Leon 13 School in Bogota, boasting an IQ of 116. However, his ambition to continue his education was cut short when he was compelled to leave school to support his family financially. Daniel Camargo Barbosa was initially arrested in Bogota in 1958 for petty theft. Later, he entered into a de facto relationship with a woman named Alcera, with whom he had 2 children. He then fell in love with another woman, Esperanza, who was 28 years old and planned to marry her, only to discover that she was not a virgin. This discovery became the source of Camargo's disturbing obsessions. He and Esperanza struck a grim pact. He would remain with her on the condition that she help him locate other virgin girls to sexually assault. Thus began a dark period of criminal collaboration between them. Esperanza acted as Camargo's accomplice, enticing young girls to an apartment with deceptive promises. Once they arrived, she would administer sodium seconal sleeping pills to incapacitate them, allowing Camargo to sexually assault them without resistance. Camargo carried out 5 sexual assaults using this method, though none of the girls were killed. The 5th victim reported the abuse, leading to the arrest of both Camargo and Esperanza, who were sent to separate prisons. On April 10, 1964, Camargo was convicted of sexual assault in Colombia. Camargo was initially sentenced to 3 years in prison, and he expressed gratitude for what he saw as a lenient ruling, promising to repent and change his ways. However, a new judge reviewed the case and increased his sentence to 8 years, which provoked anger and rebellion in Camargo. He served the full term and was eventually released in 1973. He was arrested in Brazil for being undocumented. Due to delays in receiving his criminal records from Colombia, he was deported and released under a false identity. Back in Colombia, He worked as a street vendor in Barranquilla, selling television monitors. One day, while passing a school, he kidnapped a 9-year-old girl, raping and murdering her to prevent her from reporting him. This became his first known crime involving both sexual assault and murder. Camargo was arrested on May 3, 1974 in Barranquilla, Colombia, after returning to the scene of the crime to retrieve the television screens he had left beside the victim. Although it is believed that he raped and murdered more than 80 girls in Colombia, he was convicted for the rape and murder of a 9-year-old girl. Initially sentenced to 30 years in prison, his sentence was later reduced to 25 years, and he was sent to serve his time on Gorgona Island on 24 December 1977 in November 1984. Camargo escaped from Gorgona prison, often called the Colombian Alcatraz, using a primitive boat after carefully studying the ocean currents. Authorities assumed he had died at sea, and the press even reported that he had been eaten by sharks. Against all odds, he reached Quito, Ecuador, and then traveled by bus to Guayaquil on December 6, 1984. On December 18th, he abducted a 9-year-old girl in Quevedo, located in the province of Los Rios. The following day, a 10-year-old girl also went missing. From 1984 to 1986, Camargo carried out a series of at least 54 rapes and murders in Guayaquil. Initially, the police believed the killings were the work of a gang, unable to imagine that a single man could be responsible for so many crimes. Camargo lived on the streets, surviving on money he earned by reselling ballpoint pens. Occasionally, he supplemented his income by selling clothing or small valuables taken from his victims. Camargo targeted young, vulnerable girls from lower-income families who were looking for work. He approached them, claiming to be a foreigner searching for a Protestant pastor in a church on the outskirts of town. To gain their trust, he showed them a large sum of money, promising a reward if they would guide him to the church. He acted as though he was unfamiliar with the area and hinted that the girls might have a chance to secure a job at a factory. No one found it unusual for an older man to be with a girl or young woman who could have been his granddaughter. Camargo would lead them into the woods, claiming he was searching for a shortcut so as not to raise their suspicion. If any of the girls became wary and tried to leave, he did not stop them. He raped his victims before strangling them, and sometimes stabbed them if they resisted. Once they were dead, he left their bodies in the forest. Camargo was arrested in Quito on February 26, 1986 by 2 policemen, just minutes after he had murdered a 9-year-old girl named Elizabeth. The officers who were on patrol noticed his suspicious behavior and approached him along the busy avenue Los Granados. The police discovered that he was carrying a bag containing the bloody clothes and the clitoris of his latest victim, along with a copy of Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. He was taken into custody and later transferred to Guayaquil for identification. At the time of his arrest, he gave the false name Manuel Bulgarin Solis, but he was later recognized by Maria Alexandra Velez, a survivor of one of his attacks. Daniel Camargo calmly confessed to killing 72 girls in Ecuador after escaping from the Colombian island prison. He guided authorities to the sites where the bodies of victims who had not yet been recovered were dumped. The bodies had been dismembered. While describing to the Ecuadorian authorities how he committed these sadistic crimes, he showed no remorse. After raping his victims, he attacked them with a machete, hacking, slashing, and crushing them. Camargo gave a chilling explanation for targeting children. He sought virgins because they cried, which he claimed gave him greater satisfaction. He also said that he killed out of revenge against women for their perceived unfaithfulness, resenting them for not living up to the image of what he believed women were supposed to be. In June 1986, Francisco Feber Cordero, a journalist for the newspaper Hoy Today, succeeded in arranging an interview with Camargo. Gaining access was difficult because the police were strictly blocking anyone from approaching him, and Camargo himself demanded a large fee before agreeing to be interviewed. To overcome this, the journalist posed as part of a team of psychologists who had permission to see the prisoner, allowing him to ask Camargo probing questions without raising suspicion. Camargo was convicted in 1989 and sentenced to 16 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed in Ecuador at the time. While serving his sentence at the Garcia Moreno de Quito prison, He claimed to have converted to Christianity. During his imprisonment, he was held alongside Pedro Alonso Lopez, also known as the Monster of the Andes, who is believed to have raped and murdered as many as 300 girls across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Camargo's life came to a violent end on November 13, 1994, when he was stabbed to death in prison by Giovanni Noguera, the nephew of one of his victims. He was 64 years old at the time of his death. Case 3, let me explain Gertrude Nadine Banaszewski. Born Gertrude Van Fossen on September 19, 1928, in Indianapolis, Indiana, was the third of 6 children in a working-class family of English and Dutch descent. She experienced a traumatic loss at a young age when she witnessed her father die suddenly from a heart attack. As a teenager, she left high school to marry John Stefan Banaszewski, a man of Polish ancestry from Pennsylvania, and together they had 4 children despite his occasional violent temper. After a decade of marriage, they divorced, and she briefly married Edward Guthrie, a union that lasted only a few months before ending. Gertrude later remarried her first husband and had 2 more children, but this marriage also ended in divorce in 1963. She passed away on June 16, 1990, leaving behind a complex personal history marked by multiple marriages and family struggles. Weeks after her third divorce, Gertrude Banaszewski began a relationship with a young welder named Dennis Lee Wright, who also subjected her to physical abuse. And together they had a son, Dennis Lee Wright Jr., born in May 1964. Shortly after his birth, Wright abandoned the family, prompting Banaszewski to file a paternity suit for financial support. Though he rarely contributed WY 1965, she was living alone in Indianapolis with her 7 children, struggling to cope with the pressures of raising them amid the emotional toll of multiple failed marriages, a miscarriage, and a tumultuous relationship. At 36, she was underweight and haggard, battling asthma, depression, and the effects of long-term smoking, while relying primarily on sporadic support from her first husband and performing odd jobs such as sewing and cleaning to make ends meet. She rented a modest home on East New York Street, where the low rent reflected the financial strain she faced while trying to care for a large family. Sylvia Marie Likens, born on January 3, 1949, was the third of 5 children in a family of carnival workers, nestled between 2 sets of fraternal twins, her older siblings Daniel and Diana, and younger siblings Benny and Jenny. Her sister Jenny faced lifelong challenges due to polio, which left one leg weaker than the other and required her to wear a steel brace, giving her a noticeable limp, while Sylvia grew up in this lively but physically and emotionally demanding environment. She tragically passed away on October 26, 1965, leaving behind a brief life marked by family complexities and hardship. Sylvia Likens grew up in a household marked by instability, as her parents, Lester and Elizabeth, moved frequently across Indiana during the summers to run carnival stands selling candy, beer, and soda, while constantly facing financial struggles. Their sons often traveled with them to help with the work, but Sylvia and her sister Jenny were usually kept at home or placed with relatives, often their grandmother, to ensure their safety and schooling, which meant much of their childhood was spent away from their parents amid a life of frequent upheaval and uncertainty. During her teenage years, Sylvia Likens occasionally earned small amounts of money by babysitting, running errands, or doing ironing for friends and neighbors, often sharing part of her earnings with her mother. She was known as a friendly, confident, and lively girl with long, wavy light brown hair that fell below her shoulders, and her friends affectionately called her Cookie, reflecting her warm and engaging personality despite the challenges of her upbringing. Although full of energy and spirit, Sylvia Likens often smiled with her mouth closed to hide a missing front tooth, lost during playful roughhousing with one of her brothers. She had a deep love for music, especially the Beatles, and was notably protective of her younger, more timid sister Jenny. The two sisters often spent time together at a local skating rink, where Sylvia would guide Jenny carefully, holding her hand as Jenny balanced on her unaffected foot, showing both her nurturing nature and the close bond they shared despite the difficulties of their childhood. WY June 1965, Sylvia and Ginny Likens were living with their parents in Indianapolis, but on July 3rd, their mother was arrested and jailed for shoplifting. In the aftermath, their father, Lester Likens, arranged for the sisters to board with Gertrude Banaszewski, whose daughters Paula and Stephanie had recently become friends with Sylvia and Ginny at Arsenal Technical High School. Gertrude assured Lester that she would care for his daughters as if they were her own until his return, providing a temporary home during a period of upheaval in the Likens family. Shortly after the 4th of July holiday in 1965, Sylvia and Ginny Likens moved into Gertrude Banaszewski's home on East New York Street so that their father, and later their mother, could travel to the East Coast with a carnival. The arrangement was made with the understanding that Gertrude would receive a weekly boarding fee to care for the girls until their parents returned in November to bring them home. During the first weeks at the Banaszewski household in 1965, Sylvia and Ginny Likens experienced little discipline or abuse. Sylvia often sang along to pop records with Stephanie Banaszewski and willingly helped with housework, while both sisters regularly attended Sunday school with the Banaszewski children, where the pastor praised Sylvia's devotion and piety. Although Lester Likens had agreed to pay Gertrude Banaszewski a weekly boarding fee for the care of his daughters, by mid-1965 these payments often failed to arrive on time, sometimes coming a day or two late, creating tension in the arrangement despite the initial understanding between the families. By mid-1965, Gertrude Banaszewski began expressing her frustration over late boarding payments by physically punishing Sylvia and Ginny Likens, striking them with a paddle and making harsh remarks about caring for them without proper compensation. In late August, for instance, the sisters were beaten multiple times on the back after Paula Banaszewski accused them of eating too much food at a church supper attended by the household children, marking the beginning of a pattern of abuse that escalated in severity over time. By mid-August 1965, Gertrude Banaszewski's abuse began to target Sylvia Likens almost exclusively, seemingly fueled by jealousy of the girl's youth, appearance, and potential. According to later trial testimony, the mistreatment often occurred after Sylvia and Ginny returned from Arsenal Technical High School and continued on weekends. The abuse included repeated beatings, deliberate starvation, and being forced to eat leftovers or spoiled food taken from garbage cans, with Sylvia even being accused of stealing candy she had actually purchased, marking a disturbing escalation in the cruelty she endured in late August 1965. Sylvia Likens experienced further humiliation at the Banaszewski home when she mentioned having a boyfriend in Long Beach, whom she had met earlier that year while her family lived in California. Gertrude responded by questioning Sylvia about her experiences with boys, prompting the girl, uncertain of what was meant, to explain that she had gone skating with boys and once visited a park on the beach with one of them. During the conversation, Sylvia also admitted to lying under the covers with her boyfriend, an innocent disclosure that only heightened the scrutiny and judgment she faced from Gertrude and her daughters. Shortly after the conversation about her boyfriend in late August 1965, Gertrude Banaszewski confronted Sylvia Likens, asking why she had behaved as she did, to which Sylvia simply shrugged and said she didn't know. A few days later, Gertrude returned to the topic, making a cruel remark about Sylvia's growing body, suggesting she looked like she might be having a baby. Sylvia, thinking it was a joke, responded lightly that she would have to go on a diet. Unaware of the malice behind Gertrude's words in late August 1965, Gertrude Banaszewski escalated her cruelty by telling Sylvia Likens and the other girls in the house that any girl who did something with a boy would surely end up having a baby. She then violently kicked Sylvia in the genitals, while Paula Banaszewski, 3 months pregnant at the time and seemingly envious of Sylvia's appearance, joined in the attack, knocking Sylvia off a chair onto the kitchen floor and shouting that she was not fit to sit there, marking a disturbing moment of both physical and psychological abuse that in the weeks following her arrival at the Banaszewski home in 1965. Sylvia Likens endured further humiliation and abuse during mealtimes when Gertrude, Paula, and a neighborhood boy, Randy Gordon Lepper, forced her to eat a heavily seasoned hot dog. The ordeal made Sylvia vomit, and she was then cruelly compelled to consume what she had regurgitated, demonstrating the extreme physical and psychological torment she faced in the household. In what is considered her only act of retaliation, Sylvia Likens allegedly spread a rumor at Arsenal Technical High School in 1965 claiming that Stephanie and Paula Banaszewski were prostitutes. Motivated by frustration at being singled out in the household for similar accusations and mistreatment, in 1965, after a boy at school jokingly told Stephanie Banaszewski that Sylvia Likens had spread a rumor about her, Stephanie confronted Sylvia at home, and upon admitting she started the rumor, Sylvia apologized in tears, causing both girls to cry. However, when Stephanie's boyfriend, 15-year-old Coy Randolph Hubbard, learned of the rumor, he violently attacked Sylvia, slapping her, banging her head against the wall, and flipping her onto the floor. When Gertrude Banaszewski discovered the incident, she further punished Sylvia by beating her with a paddle, intensifying the cycle of abuse she endured. In 1965, Paula Banaszewski assaulted Sylvia Likens with such force that she broke her own wrist while targeting Sylvia's teeth and eyes, and later even used the cast on her wrist to continue the attacks. Meanwhile, Gertrude Banaszewski repeatedly accused Sylvia of promiscuity and prostitution, railing about the supposed filthiness of women, and at times forced Jenny Likens to strike her own sister, punishing Jenny if she refused, further escalating the cruelty and psychological torment in the household that by 1965. Coy Hubbard and several of his classmates frequently visited the Banaszewski home to torment Sylvia Likens, both physically and verbally, often collaborating with Gertrude Banaszewski and her children. Encouraged by Gertrude, these neighborhood youths routinely beat Sylvia, sometimes using her as a practice target during violent judo sessions, leaving her with cuts, burns from lit cigarettes, and severe injuries to her genitals. On one horrifying occasion, Gertrude forced Sylvia to perform a degrading act in front of the household and her accomplices, claiming it was to prove something to her sister Jenny, exemplifying the extreme cruelty and sexualized humiliation she suffered under Gertrude's control. Sylvia Likens confessed to taking a gym suit from school because Gertrude Banaszewski refused to buy it for her. Gertrude forbade her from attending school and punished her by whipping her with a wide police belt. She then lectured Sylvia on the supposed evils of premarital sex and repeatedly kicked her in the genitals, even as Stephanie Banaszewski protested on Sylvia's behalf. The abuse escalated further when Gertrude burned Sylvia's fingertips with matches before continuing to whip her, and a few days later, she similarly whipped Jenny Likens with a police belt after a minor incident involving a single tennis shoe, demonstrating the relentless and arbitrary cruelty inflicted on the sisters. The Likens siblings lived in constant fear of alerting family members or school authorities about the escalating abuse, believing that doing so would only make their situation worse. Jenny, in particular, struggled with the urge to seek help, having been threatened by Gertrude Banaszewski that she would face the same brutal treatment as Sylvia if she spoke out. In addition to these fears, Jenny endured bullying from neighborhood girls and occasional ridicule or beatings whenever she hinted at the abuse Sylvia was suffering, leaving the siblings isolated and trapped in a climate of terror and intimidation. In July and August 1965, Sylvia and Jenny Likens occasionally saw their parents when Lester and Elizabeth returned briefly to Indianapolis, though these visits were limited by the family's travel schedule. Their final visit occurred on October 5th, during which neither girl showed any visible signs of distress, likely due to the presence of Gertrude Banaszewski and her children. Almost immediately after their parents left, Gertrude confronted Sylvia, coldly asking, "What are you going to do now, Sylvia?" Now they're gone, signaling the return to unrelenting abuse and isolation that in September 1965, Sylvia and Jenny Likens encountered their older sister, Diana Shoemaker, at a local park and told her about the abuse they were enduring from their caregiver, emphasizing that Sylvia was being singled out for physical mistreatment, often for things she had neither said nor done. They did not reveal their home address, and at first, Diana believed her sisters might be exaggerating the severity of their situation, unaware of the true extent of the cruelty they faced. Several weeks before their September 1965 encounter with their sister Diana, Sylvia and Jenny Likens had met her at the same park while accompanied by 11-year-old Marie Banaszewski. When Sylvia mentioned she was hungry, Marie gave her a sandwich to eat. Although Sylvia remained silent about this, Marie later told her family in late September, prompting Gertrude Banaszewski to accuse Sylvia of gluttony. In response, Gertrude and Paula violently choked and beat her before forcing her into a scalding bath to cleanse her of sin, with Gertrude grabbing Sylvia's hair and repeatedly banging her head against the bath whenever she fainted, further demonstrating the extreme physical and psychological abuse she endured. Shortly after the scalding bath incident in 1965, the father of a neighborhood boy, Michael John Monroe, anonymously called Arsenal Technical High School to report that a girl with open sores covering her body was living at the Banaszewski household. Because Sylvia Likens had not attended school for several days, a school nurse visited East New York Street to investigate. Gertrude Banaszewski told the nurse that Sylvia had run away the previous week and that she did not know her whereabouts, claiming that Sylvia was out of control and that her sores were the result of poor hygiene. Gertrude also asserted that Sylvia was a bad influence on her children and her sister, and the school did not pursue any further investigation into Sylvia's welfare. If the immediate neighbors of the Banaszewski family, Raymond and Phyllis Vermillion, initially viewed Gertrude Banaszewski as a suitable caregiver for Sylvia and Jenny Likens and visited the household twice while the girls were under her care. On both visits, however, they witnessed Paula Banaszewski physically abusing Sylvia, who already had a black eye, and boasting openly about her mistreatment. During the second visit, Sylvia appeared extremely meek and almost zombified in demeanor. Yet despite these alarming observations, the Vermillions never reported the abuse to authorities, leaving the girls trapped in an environment of escalating cruelty. On or about October 1st, 1965, Diana Shoemaker discovered that her sisters Sylvia and Jenny were living at the Banaszewski residence and attempted to establish regular contact. Gertrude Banaszewski refused to let Diana enter, claiming she had permission from the girls' parents to keep them apart and ordered her to leave the property. Roughly 2 weeks later, Diana happened to encounter Jenny near the home and asked about Sylvia's well-being, but Jenny replied, "I can't tell you or I'll get into trouble," reflecting the fear and control Gertrude exerted over the sisters. By early October 1965. The frequency and severity of the abuse inflicted on Sylvia Likens by Gertrude Banaszewski had intensified to the point that Sylvia became incontinent, and she was denied access to a bathroom, being forced to wet herself. On October 6th, as punishment, Gertrude threw Sylvia into the basement, tied her up, kept her naked, rarely fed her, and sometimes deprived her of water, even binding her to the basement stair railing with her feet barely touching the ground. In the weeks leading up to this, Gertrude had increasingly provoked and tormented Sylvia, falsely claiming to her household children that Sylvia had insulted them to encourage attacks. And on one occasion, she held a knife aloft and challenged Sylvia to fight back, inflicting a superficial wound when Sylvia protested that she did not know how to fight. Exemplifying the escalating cruelty and psychological terror she endured, the physical and mental torment of Sylvia Likens occasionally paused, only when the Banaszewskis watched their favorite television shows. Neighborhood children were sometimes charged a small fee to witness Sylvia's suffering and participate in humiliating, beating, scalding, burning, and ultimately mutilating her. Throughout her captivity in the basement, Gertrude Banaszewski, often with the help of her children and neighborhood youths, would restrain and gag Sylvia before placing her in a bathtub filled with scalding water and rubbing salt into her wounds. Highlighting the relentless cruelty and premeditated abuse she endured, the abuse of Sylvia Likens escalated further when Gertrude Banaszewski and her 12-year-old son, John Jr., forced her to ingest urine and feces from the diaper of Gertrude's 1-year-old son, then offered her only a small cup of water for the remainder of the day. On October 22nd, John Jr. tormented the severely malnourished Sylvia by letting her attempt to eat a bowl of soup with her fingers before snatching it away. Gertrude eventually allowed Sylvia to sleep upstairs on the condition that she stopped wetting herself, and that night, She quietly whispered to Jenny to secretly give her a glass of water before falling asleep, illustrating the ongoing cruelty and deprivation she endured. The following morning in October 1965, when Gertrude Banaszewski discovered that Sylvia Likens had urinated on herself, she forced Sylvia to insert an empty glass bottle into herself in front of the Banaszewski children as punishment before ordering her back into the basement, further intensifying the sexualized humiliation and torment she endured. Gertrude Banaszewski called Sylvia Likens to the kitchen, ordered her to strip naked, and cruelly declared, "You have branded my daughters. Now I'm going to brand you." She then used a heated needle to carve the words, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it," into Sylvia's abdomen, intensifying the physical and psychological torment that had been escalating over the previous months. When Gertrude Banaszewski could not complete the branding of Sylvia Likens, she instructed 14-year-old Richard Dean Hobbs, a neighborhood child, to finish etching the words into Sylvia's abdomen while she took Jenny to a nearby grocery store. Hobbs later described his actions as short, light etchings, but Sylvia endured the pain, clenching her teeth and moaning. Afterwards, Hobbs and 10-year-old Shirley Banaszewski led Sylvia into the basement and used an anchor bolt to attempt to burn the letters beneath her left breast, though one section was applied backwards, leaving a deep burn scar that later resembled the number 3. Gertrude Banaszewski taunted Sylvia Likens by telling her that the words carved into her abdomen meant she would never be able to marry, repeatedly asking what she would do now, to which a weeping Sylvia replied that there was nothing she could do. That same day, Gertrude forced Sylvia to display the carving to neighborhood children, falsely claiming it had been acquired at a sex party. That night, exhausted and gravely weakened, Sylvia confided quietly to her sister Jenny that she believed she was going to die, telling her she could feel it, a heartbreaking admission that reflected her awareness of how dire her condition had become. The following day in October 1965, Gertrude Banaszewski forced Sylvia Likens to write a letter dictated by her, intended to mislead Sylvia's parents into believing she had run away and to frame a group of anonymous local boys for abusing and mutilating her after she had supposedly agreed to engage in sexual activity with them. After the letter was completed, Gertrude devised a plan to have John Jr. and Jenny blindfold Sylvia and take her to a nearby wooded area known as Jimmy's Forest, intending to abandon her there to die, further illustrating the extreme premeditation and cruelty that characterized her actions. After finishing the letter in October 1965, Sylvia Likens was again tied to the basement stair railing and offered crackers, which she refused, saying, "Give it to the dog, I don't want it." In response, Gertrude Banaszewski force-fed her the crackers and, together with John Banaszewski, proceeded to beat her, focusing especially on her stomach, further intensifying the physical torment she endured on October 25th to 26th. Sylvia Likens attempted to escape the Banaszewski basement after overhearing Gertrude and John Banaszewski Jr. discussing plans to abandon her in the woods to die. Weak and injured, she tried to flee to the front door, but was caught by Gertrude before she could leave the property. She was given crackers, which she could not eat due to severe dehydration, and Gertrude force-fed them to her before repeatedly striking her face with a curtain rod until it bent into right angles. Coy Hubbard then took the rod and struck Sylvia one more time, rendering her unconscious, after which Gertrude dragged her back into the basement, continuing the relentless cycle of abuse. That evening in late October 1965, Sylvia Likens desperately tried to alert neighbors by screaming for help and striking the basement walls with a spade. One immediate neighbor later told police that she had heard the commotion coming from the basement of 3850 East New York Street, but when the noise suddenly stopped around 3 a.m., she chose not to report it, leaving Sylvia trapped and unheard in the midst of her torment. By the morning of October 26, 1965, Sylvia Likens was so weakened that she could no longer speak clearly or coordinate her movements. Gertrude Banaszewski moved her to the kitchen, propped her against a wall, and tried to feed her a donut and a glass of milk, throwing her to the floor in frustration when she could not lift the glass to her lips before returning her to the basement. Sylvia soon became delirious, moaning and mumbling continuously. When Paula Banaszewski demanded that she recite the English alphabet, Sylvia could only manage the first 4 letters and could not raise herself from the floor. Paula verbally threatened her to stand or face further punishment, and Gertrude then forced Sylvia, who had defecated, to clean herself, demonstrating the final stages of physical and psychological torment she endured. That afternoon in October 1965, several of Sylvia Likens' tormentors gathered in the basement, where she weakly tried to identify them, saying things like, "You're Ricky," and "You're Gertie," before Gertrude Banaszewski sharply ordered her to be silent. Moments later, Sylvia attempted to bite into a rotten pear she had been given, commenting on the looseness of her teeth, to which her sister Jenny reminded her that her front tooth had been knocked out when she was 7. Jenny then left Sylvia alone in the basement to perform gardening chores for neighbors, hoping to earn a little spending money, leaving Sylvia trapped and in continued agony. John Banaszewski Jr., laughing, sprayed Sylvia Likens with a garden hose brought by Randy Lepper at Gertrude Banaszewski's request in an attempt to wash her. Sylvia tried desperately to escape the basement, but collapsed before reaching the stairs, prompting Gertrude to stamp on her head and then stare at her for several moments. Shortly after 5:30 p.m., Richard Hobbs returned to the Banaszewski residence and went immediately to the basement, where he slipped on the wet stairs and fell, witnessing Stephanie Banaszewski crying and holding Sylvia's emaciated, lacerated body after being ordered by her mother to clean her, underscoring the horrific conditions and final hours of Sylvia's life. Stephanie Banaszewski and Richard Hobbs gave Sylvia Likens a warm, soapy bath and dressed her in clean clothes before laying her on a mattress in one of the bedrooms. Weak and barely conscious, Sylvia muttered her final wish, saying she wished her father were there and hoping Stephanie would take her home, while Stephanie reassured her younger sister Shirley, exclaiming, "Oh, she'll be all right," unaware of how close Sylvia was to death after enduring weeks of escalating abuse and torture. When Stephanie Banaszewski realized that Sylvia Likens had stopped breathing, she tried to administer mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, even as Gertrude Banaszewski repeatedly shouted to the other children that Sylvia was faking her death. Despite these efforts, Sylvia, age 16, succumbed to the severe injuries and prolonged abuse she had endured, marking the tragic end of her life. After Sylvia Likens had died, Gertrude Banaszewski initially struck her body with a book, shouting, "Faker, faker," in an attempt to rouse her. Panicking shortly afterward, she instructed Richard Hobbs to call the police from a nearby payphone. When officers arrived around 6:30 p.m., Gertrude led them to Sylvia's emaciated, extensively beaten, and mutilated body lying on a soiled mattress in the bedroom, presenting the letter she had previously forced Sylvia to write. She claimed she had been doctoring the child with rubbing alcohol in a futile attempt at first aid, and further asserted that Sylvia had earlier run away with several teenage boys before returning home that afternoon, bare-breasted and holding the note, fabricating a false narrative to conceal the weeks of torture she had inflicted. Paula Banaszewski, clutching a Bible, declared that Sylvia's death was meant to happen, and told her sister Jenny that if she wanted to live with the family, she would be treated like one of their own. Following Gertrude's instructions, Jenny recited a rehearsed version of events to the police, later whispering that she could reveal the full truth if she were removed from the household. Based on Jenny's statement, law enforcement promptly arrested Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie, and John Banaszewski Jr. on suspicion of murder. That same day, Coy Hubbard and Richard Hobbs were also arrested and charged. The 3 eldest Banaszewski children and Coy Hubbard were placed in a nearby juvenile detention center, while the younger Banaszewski children and Richard Hobbs were held at the Indianapolis Children's Guardians Home, all without bail pending trial. Initially, Gertrude Banaszewski denied any involvement in Sylvia Likens' death, but by October 27, 1965, she admitted that she was aware that her children, particularly Paula and neighborhood boy Coy Hubbard, had physically and emotionally abused Sylvia, stating that Paula did most of the damage and Coy Hubbard did a lot of the beating. She acknowledged having forced Sylvia to sleep in the basement on roughly 3 occasions when she had wet the bed, but became evasive when an officer suggested that her incontinence was likely caused by the mental distress and kidney injuries she had suffered, partially revealing the extent of her knowledge and complicity in the months of abuse. Paula Banaszewski, showing no remorse, signed a statement admitting that she had repeatedly beaten Sylvia Likens on the backside with her mother's police belt, once breaking her own wrist on Sylvia's jaw, and had pushed her down the basement stairs multiple times, leaving her with a black eye and other injuries. John Banaszewski Jr. admitted to having spanked Sylvia on one occasion, stating that he usually used his fist to abuse her and had burned her with matches several times, noting that his mother, Gertrude Banaszewski, had also repeatedly burned Sylvia with cigarettes, confirming the ongoing, coordinated abuse inflicted by the family and their associates. 5 additional neighborhood children who had participated in Sylvia Likens' abuse. Michael Monroe, Randy Lepper, Darlene McGuire, Judy Duke, and Anna Sisko had also been arrested. Each was charged with causing injury to a person, but was released into the custody of their parents under subpoena to appear as witnesses at the upcoming trial, ensuring that all involved in the orchestrated torment of Sylvia would be held accountable in court. The autopsy of Sylvia Likens, conducted after her death on October 26, 1965, revealed that she had suffered more than 150 separate wounds across her body and was extremely emaciated. Her injuries, in varying stages of healing, included burns, severe bruising, extensive muscle and nerve damage, and swelling of the vaginal cavity. All of her fingernails have been broken backward, and much of the skin on her face, breasts, neck, and right knee had peeled or receded, while in her final throes she had bitten through her lips, partially severing them. Coroner Dr. Arthur Kebbel listed the official cause of death as a subdural hematoma from a severe blow to her right temple, with the shock from prolonged injury and extreme malnutrition cited as contributing factors. Rigor mortis had fully set at the time her body was discovered, suggesting she may have been dead for up to 8 hours, though her recent bathing, possibly after death, could have accelerated body cooling and the onset of rigor. The funeral for Sylvia Likens was held on the afternoon of October 29th at the Russell and Hitch Funeral Home in Lebanon, Indiana, with over 100 mourners in attendance. Officiated by Reverend Lewis Gibson, her gray casket remained open throughout the ceremony, adorned with a portrait taken before July 1965. In his eulogy, Reverend Gibson remarked, "We all have our time, but we won't suffer like our little sister suffered during the last days of her life," and added, "She has gone to eternity," as he approached her casket. Following the service, pallbearers placed her casket in a hearse, part of a 14-vehicle procession to Oak Hill Cemetery, where she was interred. Her headstone bears an inscription abbreviating "Our Darling Daughter," commemorating her life despite the tragedy surrounding her final days. On December 30th, 1965, the Marion County Grand Jury returned first-degree murder indictments against Gertrude Banaszewski, her 2 eldest children Paula and John Banaszewski Jr., as well as Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard, charging them with repeatedly striking, beating, kicking, and otherwise inflicting fatal injuries on Sylvia Likens with premeditated malice. 3 weeks earlier, Stephanie Banaszewski had been released from custody on a writ of habeas corpus after her attorney successfully argued there was insufficient evidence to charge her with murder or causing fatal injuries. Stephanie waived any immunity from potential prosecution and agreed to testify against her family and other individuals implicated in the abuse and murder of Sylvia. A pretrial hearing on March 16, 1966, several psychiatrists testified before Judge Saul Isaac Rabb regarding evaluations they had conducted on 3 of the individuals indicted in Sylvia Likens' murder, concluding that all 3 were mentally competent to stand trial. The trial of Gertrude Banaszewski, her children Paula and John Jr., Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard began on April 18, 1966, at the City County Building in Indianapolis, with jury selection taking several days. Prosecutors Leroy K. New and Marjorie Wessner, who had announced on April 16 their intent to seek the death penalty for all 5 defendants, successfully argued that the defendants should be tried together, as they had acted in concert in the collective crimes against Sylvia, allowing the jury to see the full scope of offenses and ensuring that testimony about the cumulative abuse could be properly presented. During jury selection for the trial of Sylvia Likens' murder, which began in April 1966, each prospective juror was questioned by both the prosecution and defense regarding their views on capital punishment for first-degree murder and a mother's responsibility for the behavior of her children. Jurors who opposed the death penalty were excused by prosecutor Leroy K. New, while the defense removed those who worked with children, expressed bias against an insanity defense, or were disturbed by the horrific details of Sylvia's death, ensuring a jury deemed impartial and capable of considering the case's complexities. Gertrude Banaszewski was defended by William Becker, while her daughter Paula was represented by George Rice, Richard Hobbs by James G. Nettier, and John Banaszewski Jr., and Coy Hubbard by Forrest Bowman. The attorneys for Hobbs, Hubbard, Paula, and John Jr. argued that their clients had been coerced by Gertrude into participating in the abuse, torture, and torment of Sylvia, while Gertrude herself pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, asserting that her mental state should preclude criminal responsibility for the horrific acts committed under her supervision. One of the first prosecution witnesses, Deputy Coroner Charles Ellis, testified about the severe suffering endured by Sylvia Likens, describing how her fingernails had been broken backward, deep cuts and punctures covered much of her body, and her lips were essentially in shreds from repeatedly biting and chewing them. Ellis explained that Sylvia had been in an acute state of shock for 2 to 3 days before her death, likely rendering her too weak to resist the abuse inflicted in her final hours. He also emphasized that, despite the extensive swelling of her genital area, her body showed no evidence of direct sexual molestation, highlighting the extreme physical trauma and neglect she had endured on May 2nd and 3rd, 1966. Jenny Likens took the witness stand and testified against all defendants, stating that each of them had repeatedly and cruelly abused her sister, both physically and emotionally, emphasizing that Sylvia had done nothing to provoke the violence, and that the rumors and accusations made about her character were entirely false. Jenny explained that the mistreatment began roughly 2 weeks after they moved into the Banaszewski household and steadily escalated over time, adding that as the abuse worsened, her sister sometimes could not even cry because she was so severely dehydrated. Overcome with emotion during her testimony, Jenny broke down as she recalled how, only days before her death, Sylvia had quietly told her that she knew she was going to die, saying she could feel it, a moment that underscored the fear, suffering, and helplessness Sylvia endured in her final days. Sections of Jenny Likens' testimony were later supported by Randy Lepper, who recalled seeing Sylvia cry without shedding actual tears and witnessing Stephanie strike her severely after being ordered by her mother to remove her clothes in his presence. Lepper also admitted to personally striking Sylvia on multiple occasions. On May 10, 1966, Baptist minister Roy Julian testified that he had known a teenage girl was being abused in the Banaszewski household, but had failed to report it, believing, based on Gertrude's claims that Sylvia had solicited men for money, that the girl was being punished for her own actions. That same day, 13-year-old Judy Duke testified that she had witnessed Sylvia endure salt being rubbed into the sores on her legs until she screamed, and recalled another occasion when 10-year-old Shirley Banaszewski tore open Sylvia's blouse, while Richard Hobbs remarked casually, "Everybody's having fun with Sylvia," illustrating the cruelty and indifference of those surrounding her. But on the following day, Gertrude Banaszewski took the stand in her own defense, denying responsibility for Sylvia Likens' prolonged abuse, torment, and death. She claimed that her children and other neighborhood children must have carried out the acts within her home, which she described as such a madhouse, and added that she had been too preoccupied with her own poor health and depression to maintain control over her household or prevent the cruelty inflicted upon Sylvia. In response to questioning about whether she had physically abused the Likens sisters, Gertrude Banaszewski claimed that, although she had started to spank Sylvia on one occasion, she had been emotionally unable to complete the act and had not struck her at any other time, denying any knowledge of beatings, scalding, branding, or burning occurring in her home. 2 days later, Richard Hobbs testified in his own defense, recounting that on October 23rd, Gertrude had called Sylvia to the kitchen and declared, "You have branded my children, so now I'm going to brand you," before beginning to etch insulting words into her abdomen and asking him to finish the task. Hobbs admitted that blood had appeared during the branding and that Sylvia begged him to stop, but insisted his portion had been light. He further testified that he had initially believed Sylvia would not be at the household on October 26th, as Gertrude had told him she planned to get rid of her the day before and after Sylvia's death. When Marie Banaszewski testified for the defense, she broke down and admitted that she had heated the needle Richard Hobbs used to brand Sylvia Likens' abdomen. She described her mother's indifference to Sylvia's evident suffering, recalling one occasion when Gertrude sat crocheting as a neighborhood girl, Anna Sisko, attacked Sylvia. Marie further testified that Coy Hubbard would deliberately strike Sylvia in the abdomen during group assaults until she screamed. She acknowledged that all 5 defendants had repeatedly inflicted physical and emotional torment on Sylvia, but emphasized that she had most frequently witnessed her mother and sister committing these acts before Gertrude forced Sylvia to live in the basement, where the abuse intensified and ultimately led to her death. Another prosecution witness, Grace Sargent, testified that she had sat near Paula Banaszewski on a church bus and overheard her openly bragging about breaking her own wrist while violently striking Sylvia Likens in the face on August 1st, concluding with the statement, "I tried to kill her." On May 16, 1966, court-appointed Dr. Dwight Schuster testified for the prosecution regarding his extensive interviews and assessments of Gertrude Banaszewski, describing her as evasive and uncooperative. Dr. Schuster stated his professional opinion that Gertrude was sane, fully aware of her actions, and had been legally sane during October 1965, a condition he affirmed persisted to the present, standing firm under more than 2 hours of rigorous cross-examination by her attorney, William Urbecker. Deputy Prosecutor Marjorie Wessner delivered the prosecution's closing argument before the jury, highlighting the relentless mistreatment Sylvia Likens had suffered prior to her death. She emphasized that at no point had Sylvia provoked any of the defendants, nor had she received proper medical care, aside from occasional attempts to soothe her scalded skin with margarine. Wessner detailed the specific forms of abuse and neglect inflicted by all 5 defendants and their collective failure to intervene or protect Sylvia, describing the treatment as stomach-wrenching and likening its severity to the atrocities endured by prisoners in Nazi concentration camps. Referring to the premeditated nature of Sylvia Likens' death, Deputy Prosecutor Marjorie Wessner highlighted the notes Gertrude Banaszewski had forced Sylvia to write on October 24th, stating that Gertrude knew she would retain these notes until she and the other defendants had completed the murder. Holding up a portrait of Sylvia taken before July 1965, Wessner added, "I wish she were here today, with eyes as in this picture, full of hope and anticipation." William Urbecker opened the defense's closing arguments by portraying Gertrude Banaszewski as legally insane and incapable of understanding the gravity of her actions, stating, "I condemn her for being a murderess. That's what I do. But I say she's not responsible because she's not all here," while tapping his head to emphasize her mental state. He urged the jury that if she were truly sane, she should face the electric chair, but argued that her acts of cruelty, including those no one would inflict even on an animal, indicated she must be mentally unbalanced, warning the jurors they would live with their consciences if they executed an insane woman. Holding up an autopsy photograph of Sylvia Likens, Urbecker highlighted the condition of her lips to underscore the sadistic abuse inflicted and cited earlier psychiatric testimony questioning Gertrude's sanity. Following this, Forrest Bowman presented a forceful defense for the juvenile defendants, criticizing the prosecution for seeking the death penalty against children aged 16 and 13, arguing that while they had committed assault and battery, their age mitigated their responsibility and urging a verdict of not guilty for each youth. George Rice opened his closing argument by criticizing the decision to try Paula Banaszewski alongside the other defendants, arguing that the joint trial had unfairly prejudiced the jury against her. Ignoring the repeated testimony detailing Paula and her mother as the most zealous participants in Sylvia Likens' abuse, Rice contended that the evidence did not conclusively prove his client's guilt of murder. He concluded by appealing to the jury's sense of fairness, asking them to render a verdict of not guilty for a girl who had already endured the humiliation of being publicly tried in court. James Nedier began his closing argument in defense of Richard Hobbs by reflecting on Sylvia Likens' tragic death, emphasizing that she had a right to live and recalling the extreme abuse she had suffered. He highlighted Hobbs's decision to testify under intense cross-examination by the prosecution and painted him as a follower who had acted under Gertrude Banaszewski's control, suggesting that if he had not carried out her orders, he might have become a state's witness instead. Nedier criticized Jenny Likens for failing to alert authorities sooner, noting her ability to walk long distances yet not seek help, and concluded by asking the jury to find Hobbs not guilty of murder, arguing that while he displayed immaturity and poor judgment, he should not be held responsible for the crime itself. Leroy New responded to the defense's closing arguments by declaring he would let the evidence speak for Sylvia Likens, saying he saw her suffering wherever he looked. He reviewed the full extent of the abuse she endured at the hands of each defendant and directly addressed prior criticism from Forrest Bowman regarding the prosecution's questioning of children. New emphasized the distinction of responsibilities. The 5 defendants had a duty to leave Sylvia unharmed, while it was the prosecution's duty to present every piece of evidence available to fully explain the circumstances of her death. Addressing the defense's attempts to excuse their client's behavior, shift responsibility, and downplay their role in failing to protect or report Sylvia Likens, New criticized these arguments as nothing more than appeals to sympathy, saying, "All we hear is whining appeal, anything but blame where the blame belongs." He also reflected on why Sylvia had not tried to escape in the weeks before her death, suggesting, "I think she trusted in man. I think she did not believe these people would do this and continue to do it." New closed his argument by underscoring the collective responsibility of all the defendants in Sylvia Likens' abuse, urging the jury to disregard the defense's attempts to assign blame for the specific blow that caused her fatal injury. He stated, "Every mark on that girl's body contributed directly to her death. The subdural hematoma was the ultimate blow. This is the most hideous thing Indiana has ever seen," emphasizing that no evidence suggested any defendant suffered from mental illness. New called once more for the death penalty, asserting, "The issue here is not about the electric chair or a hospital, but about law and order. To go below the death penalty, in this case, would diminish the value of human life. The blood of this girl will forever remain on their souls." The trial of the 5 defendants lasted 17 days before the jury began deliberations. On May 19, 1966, after 8 hours of deliberation, the jury, comprising 8 men and 4 women, returned its verdicts. Gertrude Banaszewski was found guilty of first-degree murder, with the panel recommending a life sentence. Paula Banaszewski was convicted of second-degree murder, while Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Banaszewski Jr. were found guilty of manslaughter. Upon hearing the verdicts, Gertrude and her children wept and tried to console one another, while Hobbs and Hubbard showed no visible reaction that on May 25th, Gertrude and Paula were formally sentenced to life imprisonment, and Hobbs, Hubbard, and John Jr. each received sentences ranging from 2 to 21 years at the Indiana Reformatory, in September 1970. The Indiana Supreme Court overturned the convictions of Gertrude and Paula Banaszewski, ruling that their original trial had been unfair. The court noted that repeated requests from their defense attorneys for a change of venue and for separate trials had been denied by Judge Saul Isaac Rapp. Additionally, the court highlighted that the extensive media coverage and public attention surrounding the case had created a highly prejudicial atmosphere, making it impossible for either woman to receive a fair trial. In 1971, both women faced retrial. Paula Banaszewski pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter rather than undergo a full retrial and was sentenced to serve between 2 and 20 years for her role in Sylvia Likens' abuse and death. Despite two unsuccessful escape attempts from prison that same year, she was released in December 1972 to Gertrude Banaszewski. Meanwhile, was again convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. During the following 14 years, Gertrude became known as a model prisoner at the Indiana Women's Prison. She worked in the prison sewing shop and earned a reputation as a den mother to younger inmates, eventually being nicknamed Mom. By the time of her parole in 1985, she had changed her name to Nadine Van Fossen, a combination of her middle and maiden names, and described herself as a devout Christian. News of Gertrude Banaszewski's impending parole hearing sparked widespread outrage across Indiana. Jenny Likens and other family members vehemently opposed any possibility of her release. Two anti-crime groups also traveled to Indiana to protest Banaszewski's potential parole and to publicly support the Likens family, launching a sidewalk picket campaign. Over the next 2 months, these groups collected more than 40,000 signatures from Indiana residents, including young citizens who had not even remembered the case firsthand, as well as former inmates familiar with Banaszewski. Many former inmates describe her as a cynical con artist who had never expressed remorse for her crimes. All signatures demanded that Gertrude Banaszewski remain in prison for life. During her parole hearing, Gertrude Banaszewski expressed a wish that Sylvia Likens' death could be undone, though she minimized her own responsibility, claiming she was on drugs at the time and never really knew Sylvia, while also stating she took full responsibility for whatever happened. Considering her good behavior in prison, the parole board narrowly voted in favor of granting her release, and Banaszewski was released on December 4th, 1985. That after her release from prison in December 1985, Gertrude Banaszewski relocated to Iowa, seeking a quieter life away from the intense scrutiny and outrage that had followed her throughout Indiana. Despite her years in prison and the widespread condemnation of her actions, Banaszewski never fully accepted responsibility for the prolonged torment and eventual death of Sylvia Likens. She frequently minimized her role in the abuse, claiming that she could not clearly remember her actions during the months in which Likens suffered, and attributing much of her behavior to the medications she had been prescribed to treat her asthma. Over the next several years, she lived largely out of the public eye in the small town of Laurel, Iowa, maintaining a low profile and avoiding media attention. Gertrude Banaszewski ultimately died from lung cancer on June 16, 1990, at the age of 61, closing the final chapter on one of Indiana's most notorious cases, a case that had continued to provoke outrage and sorrow for decades after Sylvia Likens' tragic death. Regarding Gertrude Banaszewski's death and the long-debated question surrounding her sanity during both of her trials, John Dean, a former reporter for the Indianapolis Star who extensively covered the case, reflected in 2015 that he never believed Banaszewski was insane, instead describing her as a downtrodden, mean woman. Dean also compared the case to William Golding's Lord of the Flies, 1954. But he emphasized that Sylvia Likens' escalating abuse was not a chaotic outcome of children running wild, but rather children doing what they were told under Banaszewski's influence. Regarding Gertrude's underlying motive for the prolonged torment and eventual murder of Likens, attorney Forrest Bowman offered in 2014 that Banaszewski had lived a miserable life, and that the driving force behind her actions was jealousy, suggesting that the cruelty inflicted upon Sylvia stemmed more from personal envy than from any form of mental instability. After her 1972 parole, Paula Banaszewski assumed a new identity, changing her name to Paula Pace, and worked for 14 years as an aide to a school counselor at the Beeman Conrad Liscombe Union Witten Community School in Conrad, Iowa. She concealed her criminal history when applying for the position, but was dismissed in 2012 after the school discovered her true identity. Paula married and had 2 children. The daughter she had given birth to while awaiting trial in 1966, named after her mother, was later adopted. Stephanie Banaszewski, Gertrude's second eldest daughter, had the murder charges against her dropped after she agreed to testify for the prosecution against the other defendants. Although prosecutors briefly considered pursuing a separate trial for Stephanie, it never occurred. She changed her name, became a school teacher, married, and had several children. She was last known to be residing in Florida under the name Stephanie Sarikstad. When questioned at trial about her motive for testifying against her family, Stephanie Banaszewski said, "I'm just here in the hope I can help anybody," to which her mother's attorney, William Urbecker, replied, "Including yourself?" Following the arrest of Gertrude Banaszewski, the Marion County Department of Public Welfare placed her younger children, Marie, Shirley, and James Banaszewski, in separate foster homes. Their surnames were legally changed to Blake in the late 1960s after their father regained custody. Marie Blake later married and passed away from natural causes on June 8, 2017, at the age of 62. Dennis Lee Wright Jr., another child associated with the case, was adopted by a family who renamed him Denny Lee White. He died on February 5, 2012, at the age of 47. Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Banaszewski Jr. all served less than 2 years in the Indiana Reformatory before being granted parole on February 27. 1968, that Richard Hobbs died of lung cancer on January 2nd, 1972, at the age of 21, less than 4 years after his release. During the intervening years, he experienced at least one documented nervous breakdown. After his 1968 release, Coy Hubbard remained in Indiana and never changed his name. Throughout his life, he faced multiple imprisonments for various criminal offenses. In 1977, he was charged with the murders of 2 young men, but was acquitted, largely because the chief witness was a convicted criminal who admitted to being in Hubbard's company at the time of the murders. In January 2007, shortly after the premiere of the crime drama film An American Crime, Hubbard was fired from his job. He later died of a heart attack in Shelbyville, Indiana, on June 23, 2007, at the age of 56. John Stephen Banaszewski Jr. lived in relative obscurity under the alias John Blake after his release. He became a lay minister, often hosting counseling sessions for children of divorced parents. Several decades later, he publicly acknowledged that he and his co-defendants should have faced harsher sentences, while also emphasizing that young offenders are not beyond rehabilitation and highlighting how he had rebuilt his life into that of a productive citizen. He died of diabetes at Lancaster General Hospital on May 19, 2005, at the age of 52. Prior to his death, he occasionally spoke publicly about his past, admitting he had enjoyed the attention surrounding Likens' murder and claiming he had only ever hit Sylvia once. The injury to person charges filed against the other juveniles who were known to have actively participated in the physical, mental, and emotional torment of Sylvia Likens. Anna Ruth Sisko, Judy Darlene Duke, Michael John Monroe, Darlene McGuire, and Randy Gordon Lepper were later dropped, and none of them were ultimately prosecuted for their roles in the abuse. In the years that followed, each went on to live separate adult lives away from public attention. Anna Ruth Sisko died on October 23, 1996, at the age of 44, by which time she was already a grandmother. Randy Gordon Lepper, who had drawn attention during the trial by smirking while admitting he had struck Likens numerous times, died on November 14, 2010, at the age of 56. Michael John Monroe lived the longest of the group, passing away on February 16, 2023, at the age of 68. Jenny Likens later married an Indianapolis native, Leonard Reese Wade, and together they built a quiet family life that included 2 children. Despite creating a home of her own, the trauma she carried from witnessing her sister's prolonged suffering never truly left her. The memories of those events continued to haunt her well into adulthood, affecting her emotional well-being and daily life. Jenny struggled for years with severe anxiety and relied on prescribed medication to cope with the lasting psychological impact of the abuse she had been forced to endure as a child. Those close to her described her as gentle and resilient, yet deeply marked by grief and survivor's guilt. She spent much of her life trying to live peacefully while carrying the weight of a tragedy she could never forget. Jenny Likens died of a heart attack in Beech Grove, Indiana, on June 23, 2004, at the age of 54. Around 14 years before her own passing, Jenny Likens Wade came across Gertrude Banaszewski's obituary in a newspaper. She cut out the notice and mailed it to her mother with a short, bitter note expressing her sense of grim relief at Banaszewski's death. Jenny's parents, Elizabeth and Lester Likens, later died in 1998 and 2013, respectively. In the years leading up to her own death, Jenny repeatedly made it clear that she did not blame either of her parents for leaving her and Sylvia in Gertrude Banaszewski's care, explaining that they had simply trusted Gertrude's assurance that she would look after the girls until the family returned to Indiana with the traveling carnival. The house at 3850 East New York Street, where Sylvia Likens was tortured and ultimately murdered, remained empty for many years after her death and the arrest of those responsible. Over time, the abandoned property fell into serious disrepair, becoming increasingly run down and unsafe. There were occasional discussions within the community about purchasing the house, restoring it, and transforming it into a women's shelter as a way to reclaim the site for a positive purpose and honor the memory of what had happened there. However, despite these intentions, sufficient funding was never secured to move the project forward. As the building continued to deteriorate, the decision was eventually made to remove it entirely. The house was demolished on April 23, 2009, and the land where it once stood has since been repurposed and now serves as a parking lot for a nearby church. In June 2001, a tall granite memorial was unveiled in Willard Park on Washington Street in Indianapolis to honor the life and legacy of Sylvia Likens. The dedication was attended by several hundred people, including members of her family, and served as both a remembrance and a public commitment to protecting children. The inscription on the memorial speaks of a young child whose tragic death led to stronger laws and greater awareness, affirming a promise that the city and its police force strive to make Indianapolis safer for children. Alongside this message is a short poetic tribute that reflects themes of hope, strength, and relief, welcoming innocence and peace rather than suffering. Sylvia Likens' death is widely recognized as a catalyst for the introduction of Indiana's mandated reporter law, which requires any person who suspects a child is being abused or neglected to report those concerns to the authorities, significantly changing how abuse is identified and addressed. Many years later, on the 50th anniversary of Sylvia's death, residents of Indianapolis gathered in Lebanon, Indiana, to remember her and to honor all children lost to abuse. Among them was her older sister, Diana Bedwell, who emphasized that Sylvia's story and legacy must never be forgotten, and that remembering her is essential to preventing similar tragedies in the future. Sylvia's Child Advocacy Center is a nonprofit child advocacy organization created in remembrance of Sylvia Likens and dedicated to protecting vulnerable children. It was established in Lebanon, Indiana, in 2010 under the name Boone County Child Advocacy Center, and several years later, it was renamed to honor Sylvia and her legacy. The organization focuses on listening to children who have been harmed, believing them, and ensuring they are supported and protected, something Sylvia herself never received. When the center adopted her name, its leadership explained that the goal was to make sure children know their pain matters and that someone is paying attention, while acknowledging the horrific nature of Sylvia's suffering and death. The center emphasizes that her story has led to meaningful change, expressing hope that by remembering her, other children can be saved and spared similar abuse. Sylvia's Child Advocacy Center was established to support children who have suffered abuse or neglect by reducing the lasting trauma caused by their experiences and by pursuing the prevention of child abuse with unwavering commitment across Boone and Montgomery counties. The center operates through close collaboration with law enforcement agencies and the local Department of Child Services to ensure a coordinated and child-focused response. Its trained professionals conduct sensitive forensic interviews, help guide victims and families through complex legal processes, and connect children with essential medical and mental health services, working to protect their well-being while strengthening community efforts to recognize, address, and prevent abuse. Another case, let me explain. Nathan Freudenthal Leopold Jr. was born on November 19, 1904, in Chicago, Illinois, into a wealthy German Jewish family as the third son of Florence Foreman Leopold and Nathan Leopold Sr. From an early age, he displayed extraordinary intelligence, with family records noting that he began speaking unusually early in infancy. He started his higher education at the University of Chicago, later transferred to the University of Michigan, and after about a year returned to continue his studies at the University of Chicago. By the time of the murder, he had completed his undergraduate degree there with Phi Beta Kappa honors and was regarded as an exceptionally gifted student. He intended to travel to Europe before beginning his legal education at Harvard Law School. Leopold, who was of small stature and had prominent eyes, was reportedly sensitive about his appearance, which led him to immerse himself in intellectual pursuits where he excelled. He studied numerous languages and claimed fluency in several, gaining recognition for his extraordinary linguistic abilities. Leopold also achieved national attention as an ornithologist, collaborating with fellow bird enthusiasts to locate nesting sites of Kirtland's warblers and carefully documenting the parasitic nesting habits of brown-headed cowbirds, which posed a threat to the warblers. Even after his conviction, he maintained his passion for birds, raising them while in prison and later contributing to conservation efforts for the endangered Puerto Rican parrot following his parole. Richard Albert Loeb was born on June 11, 1905, in Chicago as the third of four sons to Anna Henrietta Bonin and Albert Henry Loeb, a wealthy lawyer and former vice president of Sears, Roebuck and Company. His father was Jewish and his mother Catholic. Like Leopold, Loeb was exceptionally intelligent, with a deep love for reading, particularly history and crime stories. At the age of 12, he entered the Progressive University of Chicago High School and, encouraged by his governess, completed his high school education in just 2 years. By 1923, at only 17, he reportedly became the youngest graduate in the University of Michigan's history. Afterward, he took several history courses at the University of Chicago. In contrast to Leopold, Loeb was athletic and widely regarded as handsome. Leopold and Loeb grew up in the affluent Kenwood neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, where both families maintained prominent homes. The Loeb family also owned a summer estate in Charlevoix, Michigan, part of which is now known as Castle Farms and serves as a popular wedding venue, while their Kenwood mansion stood just 2 blocks from the Leopold residence. Although the two young men were only casual acquaintances in childhood, they began spending more time together in the spring of 1920, and their friendship deepened during their years at the University of Chicago through a shared circle of friends. Their relationship became romantic in February 1921 and continued until their eventual arrest. From an early age, Loeb showed a pattern of petty theft, often stealing small items from friends, family members, and local stores. And during his high school years, he sometimes demonstrated his pickpocketing skills to impress others. After meeting Leopold, the two began committing thefts together and even devised a scheme to cheat friends and relatives during bridge games, though their efforts were mostly ineffective. Their criminal behavior escalated after they broke into Loeb's former fraternity house at the University of Michigan, where they stole items including penknives, a camera, and a typewriter, which was later used to prepare the ransom note connected to the murder of Bobby Franks. Following this incident, Loeb proposed that they commit what he described as a perfect crime, one that would draw public attention and serve as proof of their perceived intellectual and moral superiority over others. Their criminal activities soon escalated to more serious offenses like burglary, though they often targeted relatively minor items such as wine, piano benches, and vacuum cleaners. They also engaged in reckless acts like driving through neighborhoods to throw bricks through windows and committing several arsons, sometimes mingling with onlookers as firefighters responded. While Loeb appeared to enjoy these acts purely for excitement, Leopold approached them with a philosophical rationale, seeing himself as an individual hedonist. He claimed to calculate the pleasure or pain each action would bring him and to choose whichever promised the greatest personal satisfaction. This mindset extended even to his decision to commit murder, which he later described to a psychiatrist as being no different from deciding whether or not to eat pie for supper, based solely on the anticipated pleasure it would provide. Leopold was deeply fascinated by Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of the Superman, or Übermensch, which he interpreted as referring to individuals with extraordinary abilities and intellects who could rise above the laws and morals that constrained ordinary people. He believed that he and Loeb had the potential to become such transcendent figures and, according to his reading of Nietzsche, were therefore not bound by society's conventional rules or ethics. In a letter to Loeb, he wrote that a Superman, due to his superior qualities, is exempt from the ordinary laws that govern others and bears no responsibility for his actions. This philosophy seemed to justify their criminal behavior, culminating in Loeb's suggestion. After their burglary of his old fraternity house at the University of Michigan, where they stole penknives, a camera, and a typewriter later used to prepare the ransom note for Bobby Franks, that they commit a perfect crime designed to attract public attention and demonstrate their superiority. At the time, Leopold and Loeb were 19 and 18 years old, and they ultimately chose the kidnapping and murder of a younger adolescent as what they believed would be their perfect crime. They spent months carefully planning every detail, from how the victim would be abducted to how the body would be disposed of afterward. In order to conceal the true nature of the crime and mask their real motive, they decided to demand a ransom and created an elaborate scheme for collecting it. This plan relied on a complicated series of instructions designed to confuse and mislead, which would be delivered step by step rather than all at once. After an extended search for a suitable victim, much of it conducted on the grounds of the Harvard School for Boys in the Kenwood area, Leopold and Loeb ultimately selected Robert Bobby Franks, a 14-year-old boy who was the son of wealthy Chicago watch manufacturer Jacob Franks and a second cousin of Richard Loeb. Bobby lived across the street from the Loeb family home and was personally known to them, having played tennis at the Loeb residence on several occasions, which made him an accessible and familiar target in their eyes. That on the afternoon of May 21st, 1924, Leopold, using a car he had rented under the name Morton D. Ballard, and Loeb offered Bobby Franks a ride as he walked home from school. Although Bobby initially refused, since his home was less than 2 blocks away, Loeb convinced him to enter the vehicle to discuss a tennis racket he had been using. The exact sequence of events is debated, but most accounts place Leopold driving while Loeb sat in the back seat. Loeb then struck Bobby several times in the head with the handle of a chisel, dragged him into the back seat, and gagged him, resulting in his death. With a body concealed on the floor, they drove to a pre-selected dumping site near Wolf Lake on Chicago's far south side. After nightfall, they removed his clothes and hid the body in a culvert along the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks. To further obscure his identity, they poured hydrochloric acid on his face and genitals to disguise the fact that he had been circumcised, as circumcision was uncommon among non-Jews in the United States at that time. By the time Leopold and Loeb returned to Chicago, news had already broken that Bobby Franks was missing. Leopold called Franks' mother, using the alias George Johnson, and informed her that her son had been kidnapped, promising that instructions for the ransom would follow. After mailing the typed ransom note and destroying Franks' clothes, they meticulously cleaned the bloodstains from the upholstery of the rented car. Once their preparations were complete, they spent the rest of the evening playing cards, as if nothing had occurred. The morning after, when the Franks family received the ransom note, Leopold called again and dictated the first set of instructions for delivering the ransom. However, the elaborate plan quickly fell apart when Franks' father forgot the address of the store where he was supposed to receive the next directions, and it was completely abandoned later that same day when Bobby's body was discovered. In response, Leopold and Loeb disposed of the typewriter and burned the blanket they had used to transport the body before returning to their normal daily routines as if nothing had happened. Leopold and Loeb showed a disturbing casualness about the murder, often talking about it with friends and family. Leopold even joked with a professor and a female friend that he would confess and let her collect the reward money. Loeb, meanwhile, assisted a couple of reporter friends in locating the drugstore he and Leopold had intended to use for the ransom instructions, and when asked about Bobby, he remarked, "If I were to murder anybody, it would be just such a cocky little son of a bitch as Bobby Franks." Police soon discovered a pair of eyeglasses near Bobby's body. While the prescription and frame were common, the glasses had a rare hinge design that had been purchased by only 3 people in Chicago, including Leopold. When questioned about them, Leopold suggested they might have fallen from his pocket during a bird-watching outing the previous weekend. During formal questioning on May 29th, Leopold and Loeb claimed that on the night of the murder, they had used Leopold's car to pick up two women in Chicago and later drop them off, without ever learning their last names. However, Leopold's chauffeur told police that he had been repairing the car that afternoon, a statement confirmed by his wife. Meanwhile, the typewriter used in the crime was recovered from Jackson Park Lagoon on June 7th. Loeb soon confessed, claiming that Leopold had planned the crime and had killed Bobby Franks in the back seat while he drove. Shortly afterward, Leopold told police the opposite, that he had been driving and Loeb had committed the murder. Aside from these details, their confessions aligned with most of the evidence in the case. Both statements were made public by the state's attorney on May 31st. Years later, Leopold claimed that he had repeatedly urged Loeb to admit his role in the killing, quoting Loeb as saying, "Momsy feels less terrible than she might, thinking you did it, and I'm not going to take that shred of comfort away from her." Despite Leopold's assertions, most observers believe that Loeb delivered the fatal blows, supported by a witness who reported seeing Loeb driving the car with Leopold in the back seat just minutes before the kidnapping. Both Leopold and Loeb acknowledged that their actions were motivated by thrill-seeking and their delusions of being Übermenschen or Superman, as well as their desire to execute what they considered a perfect crime. Neither expressed that they had anticipated enjoying the act of murder, though Leopold admitted he was curious to experience what it would feel like to take a life. He later reported feeling disappointed to discover that the sensation was no different from anything else he had experienced. The trial of Leopold and Loeb at Chicago's Cook County Criminal Court became a major media sensation, earning the label the trial of the century, following in the wake of the trials of Harry Thaw and Sacco and Vanzetti. Both families retained the famous criminal defense attorney Clarence Darrow to lead their legal team. Although rumors circulated that Darrow had been paid $1 million, he actually received $65,000, roughly equivalent to $1.17 million in 2024. Darrow agreed to take the case because of his strong opposition to capital punishment. Although it was widely expected that the defense would argue not guilty by reason of insanity, Darrow recognized that a jury trial would almost certainly result in conviction and a death sentence. Instead, he chose to enter a plea of guilty, aiming to convince Cook County Circuit Court Judge John R. Caverly to impose life imprisonment rather than capital punishment. The trial, technically an extended sentencing hearing, since their guilty pleas had already been entered, lasted 32 days. The state's attorney, Robert E. Crow, called 88 witnesses to present detailed accounts of the crime. The defense countered with extensive psychiatric testimony aimed at establishing mitigating circumstances, citing factors such as physical abnormalities, excessive wealth, and in Leopold's case, alleged sexual abuse by his governess. One significant piece of evidence was a letter Leopold had written referencing his homosexual relationship with Loeb. Both sides used this information to support their arguments. The prosecution portrayed Leopold and Loeb as perverts, suggesting their homosexuality was a motive for the murder, while Darrow framed their relationship as evidence of insanity, arguing they were not fully responsible for their actions. Darrow called multiple expert witnesses who described a range of physical and psychological abnormalities, including dysfunctional endocrine glands and delusions that had contributed to the planning and execution of the crime. At the conclusion of the hearing, Clarence Darrow delivered an impassioned, 8-hour-long plea, widely regarded as the finest speech of his career. In it, he argued that the methods and punishments of the American justice system were inhumane and emphasized the youth and immaturity of Leopold and Loeb. Darrow drew attention to society's tolerance for large-scale violence, referencing the mass deaths of World War I, and criticized the way people celebrated such destruction when it affected the other fellows. He highlighted how even young, honorable boys had become desensitized to the value of human life through exposure to war, suggesting that the defendants' actions should be seen in the context of their age, environment, and the psychological influences that shaped them. Darrow went on to argue that Leopold and Loeb were products of a violent and blood-soaked society, shaped by the pervasive horrors of war. He emphasized that such brutality leaves a lasting mark on the human heart, noting that after the Civil War, violent crime had surged, demonstrating that crime has clear causes, much like disease. He argued that exposure to widespread bloodshed, both in Europe and in America, had dulled the boys' perception of the value of human life. Even those who had not fought in wars learned that blood and life were cheap, influencing young men like Leopold and Loeb to act without the moral restraint that might otherwise have restrained them. Darrow challenged the court to focus on the defendants as individuals rather than abstract notions of community justice, acknowledging the grief of the Franks family, but contrasting it with the tragic consequences for the families of Leopold and Loeb, whose suffering and loss were profound and inescapable. He warned that executing the boys would create immeasurable harm, arguing that the court should weigh their youth, immaturity, and the societal forces that shape their actions. Darrow continued by painting a deeply human portrait of the families behind the accused, speaking of Leopold's father, who had devoted his life to his son, nurturing his brilliance, educating him, and believing that honor and distinction awaited him, only to see those lifelong hopes collapse into ruin. He spoke similarly of Loeb's family, describing the devoted uncle and brother who attended court each day while Loeb's parents were too ill to endure the strain, anxiously awaiting news that meant more to them than anyone else could truly understand. Darrow asked whether these families had no rights or place in the court's consideration, warning that while condemning the boys to death would be the easiest and most popular choice, it would win applause only from the cruel and the unthinking. He argued that beyond the momentary satisfaction of punishment, countless humane and compassionate parents across Chicago and the nation would grieve such an outcome, reflecting not only on these boys, but on their own children, and would call instead for an end to bloodshed and a return to mercy, empathy, and the fundamental values of humanity. Darrow concluded by placing the court at a crossroads between past and future, urging that executing Leopold and Loeb would look backward, reinforcing a cycle of cruelty and making life harder for every other boy and for children yet to be born. He argued that sparing them could set a precedent of mercy, giving hope to every human being with aspirations, visions, and a future. His plea was for the future, for a time when reason, understanding, and faith guide human actions rather than hatred and cruelty, emphasizing that all life is valuable and that mercy is humanity's highest virtue. The judge was ultimately persuaded by Darrow's arguments, though he clarified that his decision rested primarily on legal precedent and the youth of the defendants. On September 10, 1924, he sentenced both Leopold and Loeb to life imprisonment for the murder, along with an additional 99 years for the kidnapping. Just over a month later, Loeb's father passed away from heart failure. That Darrow's approach as defense counsel has faced criticism for allegedly suppressing psychiatric testimony that contradicted his rhetorical goals and for relying heavily on an absolute denial of free will, a principle that underpins the justification for all criminal punishment. Leopold and Loeb were first incarcerated at Joliet Prison, where they performed menial labor, Leopold in the rattan factory and Loeb in the chair factory. Though the prison tried to keep them apart, they maintained their friendship. In 1925, Leopold was transferred to Stateville Penitentiary for an appendectomy, working first in the shoe factory and later as a clerk in the library for the prison's Protestant chaplain. He was repeatedly sent to solitary confinement for rule violations and may have been involved in the escape of 7 prisoners. At Joliet, Loeb initially worked in the prison yard delivering messages before being promoted to clerk for the deputy warden. He moved to Stateville in 1930, taking on work in the greenhouse and landscaping the prison grounds. Once the two were in the same facility, they spent much of their time together, conducting sociological research and expanding the prison's educational offerings by adding a high school and junior college curriculum on January 28, 1936. Loeb was attacked in a prison shower by fellow inmate James Day, using a straight razor, and died shortly afterward in the prison hospital. Day claimed that Loeb had attempted to sexually assault him, though he himself was unharmed. Loeb sustained over 50 wounds, including defensive cuts on his arms and hands, and his throat had been slashed from behind. News reports suggested that Loeb had made unwanted advances toward Day, and some commentators even praised Day for defending himself that a few weeks after Loeb's death, Journalist Mark Hellinger recounted in his syndicated column that an anonymous reader in Chicago had sent him a note claiming to have inside knowledge of Loeb's killing. The correspondent allegedly joked that Loeb had made a grammatical error, ending a sentence with a preposition. Some sources have attributed a similar quip to Ed Leahy of the Chicago Daily News, suggesting he wrote, "Richard Loeb, despite his erudition, today ended his sentence with a proposition." However, no evidence confirms that Leahy ever published this line, and the newspaper's actual copy from that date does not support the attribution. Although several prison officials, including the warden, believe that Loeb had been murdered, James Day was acquitted by a jury after a brief trial in June 1936. There is no evidence that Loeb engaged in sexual predation while in prison, whereas Day was later caught at least once in a sexual act with another inmate. Life plus 99 years. Leopold mocked Day's claim that Loeb had attempted to sexually assault him. The prison's Catholic chaplain, who had been a confidant of Loeb, supported this view, suggesting it was far more likely that Day attacked Loeb after his own advances had been rejected. After Loeb's death, Leopold continued his efforts to expand the prison school and remained active in teaching. In 1944, he volunteered for the Stateville Penitentiary Malaria Study, where he was deliberately infected with malaria and subjected to several experimental treatments. Later, he reflected that all of his positive work in prison and following his release was an attempt to atone for his crime. In the early 1950s, author Meyer Levin, a University of Chicago graduate, approached Leopold for assistance in writing a novel based on the murder of Bobby Franks. Leopold declined, stating that he did not want his story fictionalized, but he offered Levin the opportunity to contribute to his own memoir, which was still in progress. Although they met to discuss the possibility, Leopold ultimately rejected Levin's involvement, and Levin went on to write the book independently despite Leopold's objections. The novel, Compulsion, was published in 1950-6. In Compulsion, Levin depicted Leopold, under the pseudonym Judd Steiner, as a brilliant but deeply troubled teenager, psychologically driven to murder by his abnormal sexuality, a difficult childhood, and an obsessive attachment to Loeb. Leopold later recalled that reading the book made him physically sick, describing moments when he had to put the book down to let the nausea pass. He said the experience felt as though he were exposed stark naked under a strong spotlight before a large audience. Leopold's autobiography, Life Plus 99 Years, was published in 1958 as part of his effort to secure parole. The book remained on the New York Times bestseller list for 14 weeks and received generally positive reviews. However, some critics argued that Leopold had written it primarily to rehabilitate his public image, downplaying the darker aspects of his past. After 33 years in prison and multiple failed petitions, Leopold was granted parole on March 13, 1958. He was accepted by the Brethren Service Commission, a Church of the Brethren program, as a medical technician at its hospital in Puerto Rico. Reflecting on the opportunity, he wrote that the commission had provided not only a job, home, and sponsorship, which were essential for parole, but also companionship, acceptance, and love, making any violation of parole almost unthinkable. At Castañer General Hospital in Adjuntas, where he worked as a laboratory and x-ray assistant, he was known to neighbors and colleagues simply as Nate. Later in 1958, Leopold tried to establish the Leopold Foundation, funded by royalties from Life Plus 99 Years, with the goal of helping emotionally disturbed, developmentally challenged, or delinquent youths. However, the state of Illinois voided the foundation's charter, ruling that it violated the terms of his parole. In 1959, Leopold also attempted to block the production of the film adaptation of Compulsion, arguing that Levin's book had invaded his privacy, defamed him, profited from his life story, and blurred the line between fact and fiction. After 11 years of litigation and numerous appeals, the Illinois Supreme Court ruled against him, holding that as the confessed perpetrator of the so-called crime of the century, Leopold could not reasonably claim that any book had harmed his reputation. Leopold relocated to Santurce and married a widowed florist, Gertrude Feldman Garcia de Quevedo, on February 5, 1961, in a civil ceremony at the Brethren Service Project in Castañer. Puerto Rico, officiated by Judge Angel M. Umpierre. Despite his marriage, Leopold maintained numerous gay relationships in Puerto Rico, some dating back to his time in prison, and frequented gay bars and male prostitutes. He also continued engaging in criminal activity, including statutory rape and charity fraud, though he was never caught or prosecuted for these offenses. Leopold earned a master's degree from the University of Puerto Rico and worked as a researcher in the social service program of Puerto Rico's Department of Health. He also contributed to an urban renewal and housing agency and conducted studies on leprosy at the University of Puerto Rico School of Medicine, an active member of the Natural History Society of Puerto Rico. Leopold traveled extensively across the island to observe bird life and, in 1963, published checklist of birds of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. He spoke of writing a memoir about his life after prison, titled Reach for a Halo, but never completed it. Leopold died of a diabetes-related heart attack on August 29, 1971, at the age of 66. The murder of Bobby Franks has inspired numerous works in film, theater, and fiction, often alluding to the homosexual relationship between Leopold and Loeb without stating it explicitly. Early examples include Patrick Hamilton's 1929 play Rope and Alfred Hitchcock's 1948 film adaptation of the same name. The case also formed the basis of Meyer Levin's 1956 novel Compulsion and its 1959 film version. In 1957, two additional fictionalized accounts appeared: Nothing But the Night by James Yaffe and Little Brother Fate by Mary Carter Roberts. John Logan's 1985 play, Never the Sinner, drew directly from contemporary newspaper reports of the case and included an explicit depiction of Leopold and Loeb's sexual relationship. The Leopold and Loeb case has influenced a wide range of cultural works across literature, film, television, and theater. In his 2014 book Murder, Most Queer, theater scholar Jordan Schildkraut analyzes how changing attitudes toward homosexuality are reflected in various adaptations of the case. Other works reportedly inspired by the murder include Richard Wright's 1940 novel Native Son, the Columbo episode Columbo Goes to College, 1990, Tom Kalin's 1992 film Swoon, Michael Hankey's 1997 Austrian film Funny Games, and its 2008 remake, Barbet Schroeder's Murder by Numbers, 2002, Daniel Klaus's graphic novel Ice. Haven, 2005, the Murdoch Mysteries episode Big Murderer on Campus, Stephen Dolgenoff's 2005 off-Broadway musical Thrill Me, The Leopold and Loeb Story, Mike and Nemerever's These Violent Delights, 2020, and The Ghostface Killers in Scream, 1996. In the WB series Riverdale, Archie Andrews is incarcerated in the fictional Leopold and Loeb Institute for Delinquent Youth. Before becoming chief creative officer of Archie Comics, Roberto Aguirre Sacasa wrote an unauthorized play portraying Archie in a homosexual relationship with Leopold. It was halted by a cease and desist from Archie Comics and later staged under the title Weird Comic Book Fantasy. Gregory J. Reed's 2006 film Like Minds, also released as Murderous Intent, is also believed to draw inspiration from a case. The film includes a photograph of Leopold and Loeb in the fictional book Principles of Criminal Psychology, 5th edition, consulted by a forensic psychologist researching Gestalt psychology. Another case, let me explain, at just 16, Tony Alvin Abels became involved in a robbery in St. Petersburg, Florida in 1970, during which a man was killed. He was arrested and, in March 1971, pled guilty to first-degree murder, receiving a life sentence. After serving 12 years, Abels was released on parole in 1983 and found work as a construction laborer. Only 5 months later, on June 25, 1983, Abels broke into the apartment of 83-year-old Adeline McLaughlin, a retired widow from Worcester, Massachusetts, by smashing a window. He suffocated her with a pillow and ransacked the apartment. Neighbors were shocked by the crime, describing McLaughlin as a quiet but friendly elderly woman that on February 14, 1987, 31-year-old Deborah Kaiser from Monterey, California, was sexually assaulted and murdered. She had last been seen the day before, making a phone call from a payphone outside an apartment building. Her body was discovered by a bystander along a path near Roser Park Bridge, wearing only a blouse and jacket, while a pair of blue jeans lay nearby. Bruises were visible on her legs. Although Abels was romantically involved with Kaiser at the time, he was not arrested as a suspect in her murder. That on June 4th, 1990, Abels became involved in a violent confrontation with his girlfriend and roommate, 48-year-old Marlene Burns, which led to her death. During the altercation, Burns was pushed down a staircase and then beaten and kicked. Witnesses observed Abels leaving the apartment and wiping blood from his hands, having already called the police to report a domestic dispute. When law enforcement arrived, they arrested Abels immediately and later charged him with first-degree murder, holding him without bail at Pinellas County Jail. In January 1992, Tony Alvin Abels was convicted of murdering Marlene Burns. Although the jury recommended the death penalty in an 8-4 vote, Judge Bob Barker overrode their recommendation and sentenced Abels to life in prison, citing his mental health issues. Testimony from Abels' brother, Anthony, supported this decision, describing a troubled childhood marked by abuse from their father that ultimately led to their mother leaving the family. Factors that likely contributed to Abels' psychological state. The killings of Adeline McLaughlin and Deborah Kaiser remained unsolved until 2006, when homicide detectives submitted Abels' DNA to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. The results matched evidence collected from both victims. While Abels was not charged in Kaiser's murder, authorities consider that case closed. He was officially booked for McLaughlin's murder, though formal charges have not yet been filed. Police Major Michael Poots noted that there is a strong possibility Abels could be linked to other unsolved crimes. Another case let me explain. On July 21st, 1966, 18-year-old Agrew met his 15-year-old sister-in-law, Susan Marino, in downtown Joliet, Illinois, and asked her to go with him to the nearby Hamel Woods Forest Preserve. Once there, he made romantic advances toward her, which she promptly rejected. In a fit of anger, Agrew drew a small knife and stabbed her roughly a dozen times, killing her. Later that day, he returned home and confessed the murder to his wife, who initially doubted him. To prove his guilt, he drove her to the scene, showing her where he had left Marino's purse and shoes. Following the murder, Agrew's wife urged him to turn himself in, but he instead went to a local church and confessed to a priest, who immediately contacted the authorities. Agrew was arrested 2 days later and, during interviews, admitted that he had killed Marino because she had rejected his advances. With his confession and the strong evidence against him, Agrew was quickly convicted, sentenced to a prison term of 20 to 50 years, and transferred to Joliet Correctional Center. In December 1975, Agrew was taken to the University of Illinois Hospital in Chicago to undergo surgery to donate a kidney to his sister, Kathleen. Approximately 50 prison employees volunteered to supervise him during their days off, due to concerns that he might attempt to escape. The operation was postponed until May 4th, and after its successful completion, Agrew was required to stay in the hospital until he had fully recovered on May 11th. Agrew was reported missing from the hospital by a security guard. Earlier that day, he had slipped out a bathroom window and stolen a car, which he abandoned after crossing state lines. Using 2 fake IDs, hitchhiking, and stealing additional vehicles during his journey, he was reportedly headed for California. About a week later, he was apprehended in Central City, Nebraska, after someone reported a stolen car. Agrew offered no resistance and was subsequently extradited back to Illinois to serve the remainder of his sentence. In January 1982, Agrew was granted parole and relocated to Colorado to live with relatives, first in Boulder and later in Longmont. In late June of that year, he encountered 20-year-old Susan Becker near Boulder and stabbed her 13 times in the chest, clavicle, and neck. After murdering her, he dumped her body in Boulder Canyon, where it was discovered by fishermen on July 1st. Although Agrew was considered a suspect at the time, investigators did not pursue him thoroughly, and he was eventually dismissed as a person of interest a week after Susan Becker's body was discovered. Agrew murdered his neighbor, 94-year-old retired librarian Orma B. Smith, in her Longmont apartment. He later dumped her body in nearby Big Elk Creek meadows, where it was found the following day. 6 days afterward, a GRU attempted to abduct a woman at knife point on the campus of the University of Colorado Boulder, but was immediately apprehended and taken to the local jail. Although he was publicly named as a suspect in Smith's murder, prosecutors were unable to file charges at the time due to insufficient evidence linking him to the crime. In March 1983, a GRU was convicted of the attempted abduction and sentenced to prison, but was immediately returned to Illinois for a parole violation. He remained incarcerated until 1989, when he was paroled again. After this release, he chose to stay in Joliet, where he lived out the rest of his life. Since his final release, a GRU has not been connected to any further violent crimes, though one neighbor reported that he had privately boasted about his past murders and displayed other troubling behavior. She sought a restraining order against him, but it was denied, as a GRU had not directly harmed her. On June 29, 2009, a GRU was discovered dead in his Joliet home. An autopsy later concluded that the cause of death was an accidental overdose of prescription medication. While sorting through his belongings, relatives made a disturbing discovery. Women's purses and pieces of jewelry were found inside the house, along with newspaper clippings detailing the attempted abduction and the murders of Susan Becker and Orma B. Smith. These findings prompted renewed interest from investigators. Following a GRU's death, a cold case unit reopened the long unsolved murder of Orma B. Smith and began DNA testing to determine whether he had been responsible. Nearly a year later, forensic analysis confirmed that a GRU's DNA matched evidence recovered from Smith's crime scene. With this match, authorities officially announced that the decades-old case had finally been solved at the time of his death. A GRU was still considered a suspect in Susan Becker's murder. However, due to the absence of usable DNA evidence, investigators had to rely on other methods to assess his involvement. In May 2013, authorities concluded that, based on the similarities to his other known murders and additional evidence placing him near the crime scene, a GRU was the sole and most likely suspect in Becker's killing. As a result, he was posthumously identified as a serial killer, with state police and the FBI announcing plans to review other cold cases to determine whether he might be responsible for additional violent crimes. As of January 2025, no further cases have been definitively linked to a GRU.